He opened his eyes in a body that wasn't his own, and the first thing he heard was laughter. Hundreds of voices. The laughter rolled down the stone tiers of the amphitheater from top to bottom and fell on him like a bucket of ice-cold water. He stood in the center of a circular arena, white sand beneath his feet. Above his head, an open sky the color of wet iron. A sign made of light hung before him. The letters on it glowed evenly and calmly. Class determined. Builder. He didn't know what a class was. He didn't know what a builder was. He didn't even know his own name. It came to him a second later, like a stranger's coin tossed into his palm. Darren Cole, 18 years old, an orphan, the lower-tier orphanage. Memories poured into his mind in fits and starts. Cold corridors. Porridge made from gray flour. Night work unloading carts for 2 copper tokens. And a single goal that had kept this boy afloat for all 18 years. The academy. The only door leading upward. The only way to stop being a nobody. He'd taken the entrance exams 3 years in a row. He'd passed on his 4th try. And now he stood in the sorting arena and was assigned to a class that made it all meaningless. The laughter wouldn't stop. He looked up. The stands were packed. Freshmen in gray jackets, upperclassmen in blue. Above them, the faculty box, and even higher, the box for the trustees from the city houses. Everyone was staring at him. Someone was whistling. Someone was slapping their palms against the stone. A woman in a red cloak on the middle tier was laughing so hard she was wiping her eyes. Darren looked at the plaque again. It hadn't changed. He tried to remember how it worked. The memory of his new body prompted him. In Calderia, classes are assigned through the tablets of assignment. There are 9 of them: blade, spear, shield, windcatcher, flame, bone, shadow, call,
and plow. The first 8 are fighters. Plow refers to artisans and was considered shameful, though at least useful. Builder wasn't on the list. No such class existed. The master of allocation stood by the tablet, staring at it with his mouth agape. He was a gaunt old man in a black robe with a copper chain across his chest. His name was Arash Vent. He had presided over the allocation for 40 years. He turned toward the faculty bench and spread his arms wide.
He said that, for the first time in 120 years, the tablet had produced a class that wasn't in the registry. The faculty box erupted in a murmur. A man in a white uniform with silver trim rose from it. Rector Valian Dorn. Tall, upright, a face like an axe. He asked loudly, so that the entire arena could hear, whether the tablet could be mistaken. Arash Vent replied that the tablet never makes mistakes. It reads what is already within a person. Rector Dorn looked down at Darren with a long, steady gaze. Then he said that the Academy trains those who kill beasts beyond the boundary. He said that the Academy does not train masons. He said the boy would be given 1 decade to prove his right to be there. If, in 10 days, he failed to demonstrate a single combat achievement, he would be expelled and sent back to the lower tier. The amphitheater erupted. The tiers were shouting and clapping. Darren stood on the white sand and listened as 2,000 people rejoiced at his demise. He clenched his fists. He didn't take his eyes off the rector. He was 18 years old and couldn't remember anything except the last 10 minutes, but one thing he understood right then and there. These people had decided for him that he was trash. Not because he'd done anything, but because the glowing sign had displayed a word they didn't like. Then something clicked in his head. It wasn't a sound. It was a sensation, as if someone invisible had stood behind him and placed a hand on his shoulder. A second sign unfolded before his eyes. Only he could see it. Register of the Erected is linked. Bearer, Darren Coliu. Entries, 0. He blinked. The label didn't disappear. It hung right there in the air in front of his face, pale green and translucent, and through it he could see the laughing tears. Below the heading were 3 lines. Body unit. course unit, bark unit. Below was a fourth line, gray and faded. The record opens when the constructed begins to be used. He read it 3 times. He didn't understand a thing. Arash Vent was walking toward him across the arena. The old man stopped 2 steps away and said quietly, so the tears wouldn't hear, that the boy had better leave today. He said that the decade wasn't about mercy. It was a spectacle. The rector needed the expulsion to look fair. Darren asked him directly if it had ever happened before that the tablet had assigned a class that didn't exist. Arash Vent paused. Then he replied that it had happened once, 120 years ago. And that man had also received a decade. Darren asked what had become of him. The old man looked him in the eyes and said that this wasn't written about in the textbooks. Then he turned around and walked back to the tablet. Darren remained standing alone on the white sand. He lowered his gaze to his hands. They were broad and rough, calloused from unloading carts. Not the hands of a swordsman, the hands of a laborer. He shifted his gaze to the green plaque. The record opens when what has been erected begins to be used. He didn't know what that meant. But there was something alive in those words, something that wasn't mocking him. He left the arena through the lower tunnel. Behind him, they were already calling the next contestant. Someone had received the blade, and the tears roared with approval. Darren didn't look back. The tunnel led him into the academy's inner courtyard. The Chaldean Academy of the Limit stood on 4 hills and was larger than the entire lower tier combined. Stone buildings with tall windows. Training grounds with resin dummies. Armory warehouses. 5 training towers. 1 for each discipline. Darren walked along the gravel path, feeling eyes on his back. News traveled faster than he did. 3 upperclassmen in blue walked past him. One shoved him in the shoulder, causing Darren to stumble. He told the others, "Here comes the great stonemason." Another asked if he would build them a restroom. They laughed and walked away. Darren stopped. He watched them go and didn't move. Then he kept walking. He wasn't going to get into a fight just 2 hours into his life in this body. He was going to figure out the rules. First-year students were assigned rooms in Building 4. The dorm supervisor turned out to be a heavy-set man with a logbook, and he leafed through the pages for a very long time. Then he said that there were no dorm rooms allocated for the builder class because that class wasn't listed in the roster. Darren asked where he was supposed to live then. The dorm supervisor shrugged and said it wasn't his problem. He said that beyond the perimeter of the service yard, there was an old tool shed. It had been empty for 6 years. The roof was leaking, but there was a dry spot in the corner. Darren looked at him silently. Then he said he'd take the key. The commandant grunted and tossed the key onto the counter. The shed stood right up against the wall at the border between the academy and the cliff. The door hung on a single hinge. Inside, it was dark and smelled of rotten wood and mice. Darren pushed the door open and stepped inside. The floor was littered with splinters and rusty hoops. In the far corner lay a pile of old planks. Shreds of shingles hung from the ceiling, and through a hole in it, the sky was visible. He stood in the doorway and looked at it all. For 18 years, a boy named Darren Cole had been heading toward this academy. He'd gotten it. He'd gotten the shed. He tossed his bag of belongings onto the floor. He sat down on an upside-down crate and stared at the wall. The green sign was still hanging in his peripheral vision. 0 entries. He thought for a long time. He thought about the word builder. He thought about the word erected. And about how a record is opened when the erected structure begins to be used. Not when it was built, but when people started using it. He raised his head. He looked at the hole in the roof. Then he looked at the pile of boards in the corner. Then he stood up. He didn't know if he was building it right now. He only knew that in 10 days he'd be expelled, that the whole academy was laughing at him. and that the only thing in this world that wasn't laughing at him was the green sign with 4 lines on it. He pulled out the boards. He found a rusty hammer and a box of nails. He climbed onto the beam under the ceiling. He worked until dark. The shingle was rotten and crumbled in his hands. He pried it out and replaced it with boards. He bruised his fingers and broke a knuckle, but he didn't stop. By the time the first moon rose, the hole in the roof was gone. He climbed down, sat on the floor, and looked at the sign. It hadn't changed. 0 entries. He stared at it for a very long time. Then he lay down on the planks and fell asleep. The rain started at 3 in the morning. He woke up because it was dry. He lay on the floor of the rotten shed, listening to the water pounding against the boards he'd nailed down, keeping it from seeping inside. He didn't move. He just lay there and listened. And then the sign lit up. Use recorded, shelter, 1 user, first entry entered in the register. Body, +1. Darren sat up so abruptly that he hit his head on a beam. He stared at the number. Body, 2. He raised his hand and clenched his fist. He didn't feel anything out of the ordinary, but the number was there. It was real. He reread the line 3 times. Usage recorded. Not construction, usage. He himself was a user. He had built the roof, and he had slept under it, and the system had counted it. He slowly sank back down onto the planks. Rain was pounding down from above. He stared into the darkness, and something was forming in his mind that made his breath catch. A roof over 1 person equaled 1 unit. 1 roof. 1 person. He thought about a house where a family of 6 lives. He thought about a bridge that 400 people cross every day. He thought about a city wall behind which 20,000 people sleep. He sat down again. He stared into the darkness without blinking. The academy had been laughing at him all day. The rector had given him 10 days to demonstrate his combat proficiency. No one in this world, including himself, knew that the tablet had given him a class that wasn't useless. It had given him the only class that grows not from killing, but from how many people live under what you've built. Darren Cole sat in a rotten shed on the edge of a cliff and counted in his head. By morning, he knew what he would be doing for all 10 days. He didn't sleep until dawn. He sat on the floorboards, staring into the darkness and counting. A roof over 1 person's head counted as 1. So the system didn't count square footage or nails. It counted people. It counted how many people got what they needed from the structure. He didn't know if that was correct. He only knew there was one way to find out: to build something that would benefit not just 1 person, but many. In the morning, he stepped out of the shed. The rain had stopped. The farmyard was flooded. The academy was waking up. The clang of wooden swords could already be heard from the training grounds. Darren didn't head that way. He took a detour along the gravel path that ran past the farm buildings, looking around as he went. He was looking for a place where people wouldn't feel comfortable. He found it 20 minutes later. A path ran between the 4th building and the dining hall. Straight, short, and a ditch cut right through the middle of it. A drainage ditch waist deep and 2 steps wide. They dug the ditch when they built the dining hall and never filled it in. The water in it was black. A single plank had been thrown across the ditch. Rotten, crooked. It rested on 2 stones and sagged in the middle. Darren stood to the side and watched. Freshmen were walking by. Each one approached the plank. Each one stopped. Each one stepped onto it, balancing carefully. One girl slipped and nearly fell into the water. She cursed and kept walking. 40 people crossed the plank in a quarter of an hour. Darren was counting. 40 in a quarter of an hour. 3 breakfasts a day, lunch, dinner. He did a rough calculation and came up with more than 600 crossings a day. He looked at the rotten plank and felt a chill run down his spine. He turned around and walked back to the shed. He pulled out everything he could find from there. Old planks, hoops, a hammer. There was only a third of a box of nails left. That wasn't enough. He went to the farmyard storage shed. The storekeeper was a small man with a notepad, and he didn't even look up. He asked for the requisition number. Darren said there was no requisition. The storekeeper asked for the material grade. Darren answered. The storekeeper looked up and eyed him with curiosity, as if he were a rare insect. Then he said that materials were issued according to disciplinary regulations. They issue a blade, spears are issued, plows are issued. They aren't issued to builders because there's no such discipline. Darren asked if he could take some scrap. The storekeeper thought for a moment. Then he said that behind the stables, there was a dump where they piled up broken stone and scrap lumber left over from the repairs to the third tower. It's trash. It's written off. Nobody cares about the trash. He said this with a smirk. He thought he was belittling Darren. Darren thanked him in all seriousness and left. The storekeeper watched him go and stopped smirking. The dump was huge, a pile of broken stone 3 times a man's height. Broken beams, pieces of floor slabs with protruding support beams. Darren walked through it for 2 hours, sorting through the debris. He didn't know how he knew which beam would hold and which wouldn't. He simply picked them up and knew. His body's memory couldn't have given him that knowledge. Darren Cole had hauled carts. He had never built anything. The knowledge came from somewhere else. It came along with his class. He chose 4 beams. He dragged them one by one across the entire yard. Each one weighed more than he did. He hauled them until noon. Then he went back for the stone. He carried the stone in a flour sack, 8 pieces at a time. He made 40 trips. By evening, a mountain of material lay by the ditch, and Darren sat nearby on a rock, unable to unclench his fingers. People were walking by on their way to dinner. They watched. Someone asked aloud if he was burying someone there. Someone else said that the mason had decided to fill in the ditch so that no one would laugh at the plank anymore. Everyone laughed. Darren sat and listened. Then he stood up and started working. He wasn't building a bridge. He didn't know how to build bridges. He was doing what he saw in his head. He drove 4 piles made of beams into the bottom of the ditch, 2 on each side. He struck them with the heel of his hammer until his hands gave out. Then he struck them with a stone. He laid 2 beams across the top and secured them with hoops and wedges. He laid the planks. He couldn't build a railing because he didn't have enough lumber. He built side walls along the edges out of broken stones laid dry. He worked all night. He worked under the first moon and under the second. At 3 o'clock it started to rain, and he worked in the rain. He fell into the ditch twice. He climbed out and kept going. The knuckles on his right hand were scraped down to the flesh. He wrapped them in a rag and kept going. By dawn, a 2-step wide walkway stretched across the ditch. Even, solid. It didn't sway. Darren stood knee-deep in the black water and looked up at it from below. Then he climbed out and sat down on the ground nearby. He waited. The first one passed at the beginning of the 7th. A guy in a gray jacket was walking to breakfast without looking where he was going. He slowed down habitually in front of the ditch. Then he saw the walkway. He stopped. He looked at Darren sitting in the mud. He didn't say anything. He stepped onto the walkway and walked across it without slowing down. The sign lit up. Use recorded, crossing, 1 passage, turn +1. Darren didn't move. He stared at the line and breathed very slowly. A minute later, 2 people passed. Turn +2, then a group of 6, turn +6. Then a stream of people. People were on their way to breakfast, walking along the walkway and not looking down because there was no reason to. The walkway held. The sign flashed over and over. Step +1, step +3. Step +1, step +4. Darren sat in the mud by his own bridge, and the number before his eyes kept rising. Step 20, move 48, move 69. By the end of breakfast, the number had stopped at 112. He raised his hand. He looked at it. Then he swung it sharply to the side. His hand moved so fast that he didn't even see the motion himself. He froze. He did it again. The air whistled. He stood up. He took a step and found himself 3 steps away from where he had been standing. He stopped and stood motionless. Then he looked at the floor. 600 passes a day. Each pass counts as 1. He counted in his head, but the numbers got so high that he stopped counting. He went back to the shed, lay down, and fell asleep instantly. He was awakened by a kick to the door. The door flew off its last hinge. 3 men stood in the doorway. The first was tall and fair-haired, wearing a senior-year blue jacket, and the blade insignia hung on his chest. Darren recognized him from what he'd heard. Castle Varan, sophomore, son of House Varan, top of his class. Behind him stood 2 of his men. Castle walked inside and looked around. He said he'd heard rumors that a stonemason had shown up at the academy. He said he didn't believe it. He said he'd come to see for himself. Darren sat on the planks and said nothing. Castle walked around the shed. He poked a pile of wood chips with the toe of his boot. He looked up at the new roof. Then he turned and said he'd seen the decking by the dining hall. He said the decking was good. He said it without mockery, and that was worse than mockery. Then he asked why Darren had built it. Darren replied that it was inconvenient to walk across the moat. Castle smiled. He said that was a very correct answer. He said that's exactly how servants answer. He said that the academy trains those who stand on the wall when the beasts come from the boundary. And that, if a person, instead of thinking about the wall, thinks about how people can walk more comfortably to the dining hall, then that person has no place among those who will die. He said that in 8 days, Darren would be expelled, and that was right, and he didn't want the boy to hold on to any illusions. Then he nodded to his men. One of them stepped toward the pile of sorted stone that Darren had hauled over as a reserve and began scattering it across the courtyard with his boot. The second man grabbed a hammer and walked out. Darren stood up. Castle looked down at him and said very calmly that if Darren raised a hand against a senior, he'd be expelled today, not in 8 days. He said that was also a rule. He said rules existed so that people like Darren would know their place. A cracking sound. Darren turned his head. He didn't run. He walked. He left the shed and walked across the yard at a steady pace. Castle walked beside him and said something about respecting stubbornness. Darren didn't hear him. He walked out to the ditch. Castle's second man was standing in the middle of the plank walkway, striking the boards with a hammer. 2 had already been broken. He swung again. Darren stopped 10 paces away. He watched. The sign before his eyes flickered. Recording damaged. Turn -1. He looked at the line. Then at the man with the hammer. -1. He felt nothing except that it had grown very quiet in his chest. He walked forward. Castle had said he'd warned him. Darren didn't stop. He stepped out onto the deck. The man with the hammer turned around, saw his face, and hesitated for a moment. He swung at Darren. Darren saw the movement so slowly that he had time to make out every chip on the hammer's head. 112 units of movement. He stepped aside. The hammer swung through empty air. Darren grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it, and the hammer fell onto the planks. He didn't strike the man. He grabbed him by the collar and belt, lifted him off the deck, and set him down on the shore. Like a sack. The man weighed like a sack. The whole thing took 2 heartbeats. Castle Varan stood watching, and a smile crept off his face very slowly. He sat by the ditch until evening. He watched people walk across the deck, listened to the flashing sign, and thought. 600 passes a day. That's a lot for a shed and nothing for what he needs. The rector gave him 8 days. In 8 days, the walkway will give him 4,500 steps, but not a single unit of body or a single unit of bark. He'll become a very fast deadbeat who'll be expelled. Speed isn't the measure. At the academy, performance is measured in the arena against a resin dummy. You can't outrun the dummy. You have to break through it. He stood up and went to look for people at the academy who were suffering. He found them at sunset. The infirmary stood on the northern slope, separate from the main buildings. It was a low stone building with a flat roof. Darren went there because he remembered a word from the sign, bark. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew he had 3 lines, and so far, only one was growing. The infirmary greeted him with a distinct smell. Wet stone, rotting grass, and something sour. Inside were 30 beds, 20 of which were occupied. First years after training, 2 upperclassmen with burns from the flame. In the far corner lay a man without a right arm, staring at the ceiling. Darren stopped in the doorway. The ceiling above the cots was wet. A dark stain ran up the wall from the floor to the very top. Water was dripping into a bucket held out below, and the sound was steady and irritating. On the third bunk from the entrance lay a young man, shivering. He was wet. Water was dripping directly onto his blanket from above. A woman in a gray apron approached, held a basin out for him, moved the bucket aside, and said nothing. She did it like someone who'd been doing it every day for 6 years. Darren asked her why it was leaking. She looked at him wearily and said that the roof was flat and the water wouldn't run off, and that the gutter had been clogged for 3 years. She said she'd filed a request 4 times. She said the money for repairing the infirmary was in the budget every year, but every year it was diverted to the training grounds because the academy trains fighters, not patients. Darren asked her name. She said her name was Ursa Mall, and she'd been the infirmary supervisor for 11 years, and that if he'd come to make fun of her, the door was right behind him. Darren said he'd come to fix the roof. She looked at him. Then she laughed briefly and bitterly and said he was that very same bricklayer. She said the whole academy was talking about nothing but him. She said he could climb onto the roof if he wanted, but he shouldn't be surprised when they kicked him out. Darren walked out and walked around the building. The roof was flat and covered with slabs set in mortar, and the mortar had crumbled away. Water pooled in puddles. There were gutters at the corners, and all 4 were clogged with caked-on pine needles and mud. He climbed up the wall without a ladder. He wasn't thinking about what he was doing. He simply placed his foot on a ledge in the masonry and kept climbing, reaching the roof 7 seconds later. He stopped at the top and looked at his hands. He wouldn't have been able to do that before. He'd been working all night. He knocked the gutters clear with an iron rod. A stream of water gushed out of the first one, a crack as long as his forearm. Black sludge gushed out of the second one. By 3 o'clock, water was pouring down from the roof, and 4 streams were streaming down the walls. Then he set to work on the slabs. He chipped away the crumbling mortar, cleaned out the joints, and filled them with fresh mortar. He mixed the mortar from crushed lime from the dump, sand, and water from the ditch. He didn't know the correct proportions. He picked up a handful and figured it out. He was creating a slope. A flat roof shouldn't be flat. He placed gravel under the slabs on one side and leveled them so that water would flow toward the drains. He laid down a little over 200 slabs. He hauled them one by one from roof to roof and back again. By dawn, his fingers were stiff, and he couldn't raise his arms above his shoulders. He went downstairs and entered the infirmary. Irsa Moll was sitting at the entrance with her eyes closed. Darren walked over to the third bed. The boy's blanket was dry. The ceiling above him was dry. He raised his head and stood there, staring at the dry ceiling. The sign didn't flicker. He waited. Nothing. He stood in the infirmary at 5 in the morning, covered in lime and soaked through, staring at the line that read Cora Unit, and it didn't change. He didn't understand. He'd fixed it. People were using it. He went outside, sat down on the steps, and stared at the ground. Then it dawned on him. The floor didn't count until someone walked on it. The shed's roof didn't count until he fell asleep under it. The system doesn't count repairs. The system counts the moment when a person gets what they need from a structure. A roof over a sick person is needed at night. But it's not the roof that's needed. What's needed is for the person to feel better. He went back inside. He sat down next to Irsamol and asked her what her patients needed besides a dry ceiling. She opened her eyes. She looked at him for a long time. Then she started talking and couldn't stop. She said there was only one stove for 30 beds, and it stood by the entrance. In the far corner, ice formed on the wall in winter. She said water was carried from a well 200 paces away, and she carried it all by herself, which is why the wounded were washed only once every 3 days. She said there was no outhouse inside, so the bedridden soiled themselves, and she did the laundry. She said the windows face north, and the infirmary is dark all year round. She can't see the color of a wound and knows when it's festering only by the smell. She spoke for an hour. Darren listened and didn't interrupt. When she fell silent, he asked one question. He asked how many people pass through the infirmary each year. She said about 800. He sat in silence. 800 people a year. And every one of them is suffering. He stood up and said he'd be back by evening. He worked for 6 days. He slept 2 hours a day right on the infirmary floor in a corner. He hauled stone from the dump in sacks and carried it at night so as not to attract attention. He knocked out 3 windows in the north wall. He did it without a blueprint. He could see where the load was concentrated. He installed a lintel made of a beam and dismantled the masonry beneath it, and the wall stood. Ursha Mole watched this in silence, biting her nail. He built a second stove at the far end and ran the chimney through the wall. He rebuilt the first one too, because it was smoking. He dug a trench from the well and laid a trough in it made of halved split beams, sealing the joints with resin from the dump, and led the water to a stone basin at the infirmary's entrance. 200 steps had turned into a faucet made from a wooden plug. He dug a pit behind the infirmary, built a 4-compartment outhouse over it, and cut a passage from the building. He did all this alone. He didn't ask for help. No one offered any. People came to watch. On the first day, there were 2 of them. By the third day, there were about 40 people standing by the infirmary. They didn't help. They watched as a freshman, in a tattered jacket, installed a stove at 6 in the morning. Some laughed. Others stopped laughing on the second day. Someone on the 4th day brought him a pitcher of water, silently set it down beside him, and left without saying a word. On the morning of the 6th day, Irsa Mole brought water to the wounded man in the far corner. She turned on the faucet at the entrance. The water began to flow. She filled a mug in 10 seconds instead of half an hour. She carried it to the cot, and the young man without a right arm sat and drank. He drank, lay back down, closed his eyes, and his face smoothed out. The display flashed. Usage recorded. Ghost. 1 user. Cora +1. New line opened. Return 1. Darren stood with a trowel in his hand, staring at the 4th line on his display. Return. He didn't know what it meant. Then the stove in the far corner burned down to a steady heat, and the 3 men lying against the cold wall stopped shivering. Bark +3. Then someone used the outhouse, Cora +1. Then light from the new windows fell on the bed, and Ursa Mole leaned over and for the first time in 11 years saw the edges of her wound without a candle. Cora +1. The sign began to flash and didn't stop. 20 patients, the stove, water, light. Every morning, each of them received something, and each time a line appeared. Cora 12. Cora 29.
Cora 44. Darren went out onto the street, sat down on the steps, and looked at his hands. The knuckles on his right hand had been scraped down to the flesh 6 days ago, and he hadn't bandaged them even once. He looked closely. The skin was intact. He raised his left palm. On it was a cut from a stone, a pale, sustained the day before yesterday. There was no cut. There was a white mark, and it was fading as Darren watched. He touched it. Nothing. Return to one. He sat on the steps of the infirmary, which he had repaired himself, and his body was healing its wounds because, inside that building, 20 people were feeling better. He laughed, quietly and hoarsely. He hadn't laughed since the day he opened his eyes in the arena. Ursa Mold came out and stood beside him. She looked at him, and her face bore an expression he couldn't read. Then she said that over the course of 11 years, she had submitted 19 petitions. She said that not a single one had received a response. She said that a boy, whom the entire academy called the bricklayer, had come and done in 6 days what had taken her 11 years to complete. She said she didn't understand why. Darren remained silent.
He couldn't tell her the truth. Then she said one more thing. She said that this morning, people from the rector's office had come to the infirmary. They were counting the windows. Darren looked up. She said that cutting openings in a load-bearing wall without permission constituted damage to academy property. She said that for that, you'd be expelled without a 10-day notice period. She said the boy should have asked. Darren stood up. He looked at the building. He said that if he'd asked, they would have refused. Ursa Mol was silent for a long time. Then she said, yes. They would have refused. He walked toward the barn. The courtyard was empty. They were waiting for him by the barn. Orash Vent stood by the broken-down door in a black robe, his hands behind his back. The old man wasn't looking at Darren. He was looking at the roof. Without turning around, he said that the shingles were laid overlapping with the proper overlap. He said that a boy who hauled carts couldn't possibly know that. Darren stopped 3 paces away and remained silent. Orash Vent turned around. He said he'd seen the floorboards. He said he'd seen the infirmary. He arrived at the 4th building in the dark. The freshman dorm stood like a long 3-story box with narrow windows, and water was leaking not from the roof, but from the walls. Darren walked around it twice. He touched the masonry, examined the joints, and listened. He didn't know how to explain what was happening. He placed his palm on the stone and could tell where it was cold. The north wall was icy. The mortar in the joints had crumbled away to the depth of a finger, and a draft was coming through the cracks. 300 people lived inside, and Darren knew from the memory of this body that in winter they slept fully clothed in the northern rooms, that they plugged the windows with rags, and that this made it impossible to breathe. He stood by the wall and counted. 300 people. Every night. He climbed up the wall to the 2nd floor and peered through a window. 6 people were sleeping in the room. The blankets were thin. One guy was curled up against the wall, and the cold was biting him even in his sleep. Darren climbed down and walked over to the dump. He hauled materials all night. Lime, sand, fine-grained crushed stone. He mixed the mortar in a trough made from a split beam and started at the north corner. He scraped out the old mortar from the joint with an iron rod, blew into the joint, packed in the new mortar, and smoothed it out. Joint by joint, meter by meter. He worked in the dark by touch, and it was actually easier that way, because his fingers understood better than his eyes. By 4 in the morning, he had finished a third of the wall. The sign hadn't flickered even once. He didn't wait. He already knew the rule. The system waits for the moment when a person receives. People were sleeping. They hadn't received anything yet. He kept working. At 6 in the morning, people began to come out of the building. Someone stopped and looked. Someone asked what he was doing. Darren replied that he was doing the seams. The guy stood there for a moment and then walked away. By noon, he had finished the entire north wall and started on the east wall. His hands were shaking so much that he kept dropping his trowel. He'd pick it up and keep working. The cuts were healing right on the spot. Return was working. He felt it as warmth beneath his skin. It was the only thing keeping him on his feet. By evening, he had finished both walls. He sat down on the ground at the corner of the building and waited. He waited for nightfall. At 10 o'clock, the lights in the windows began to go out. At 11, it grew quiet. Darren sat with his back against his own masonry, staring at the plaque. At a quarter to 12, it flashed. Usage detected. Shelter. One user. Body +1. He sat up straight. Then it started. Body +2. Body +1. Body +4. Body +1. 300 people were falling asleep in warm rooms, and each of them was adding 1 to his tally. Darren sat in the dark by the wall, and his count crept upward. Body 40. Body 112. Body 189. By 1 o'clock in the morning, it had stopped at 264. 36 people did not spend the night in the building that night. Darren stood up. He did so effortlessly. His body rose on its own. He looked at his hand, clenched his fist, and heard his knuckles crack. He walked over to the pile of broken stone that he himself had brought there. He picked out a piece the size of his head. He picked it up with 2 fingers. The stone crumbled. Darren stared at the shards in his palm and stood still. Then he laughed out loud in the empty courtyard at 1 o'clock in the morning. He didn't go to sleep. He kept going. For the rest of the night, he kept the porch of Building 4 because it had sagged and was uncomfortable to walk on. In the morning, he received 40 hods for it. He didn't count them. He didn't count them anymore. The inspection was scheduled for the second half of the day. By then, word had spread throughout the academy. People were flocking to the arena as if for a festival. Not because anyone was interested in a stonemason. It was because Rector Valian Dorn had personally announced the inspection from the platform, and that happened only once every few years. Darren arrived at the arena an hour early. He sat on a stone bench in the lower tunnel and stared at the wall. The sign hung right before his eyes. Body 264. Move 571. Shell 89. Return 2. He didn't know if that was a lot or a little. He had no point of reference. He hadn't seen the others strike. He had never struck anyone in his life. Arash Vent entered the tunnel 10 minutes before the start. The old man stopped beside him, but didn't sit down. He said the resin dummy weighed 40 stones and could take a freshman's blow without a mark. He said the standard for passing was a crack. He said blade freshmen usually cracked the dummy by the end of their first year, not within the first 10 days. He said they'd expect Darren to crack it today. Darren asked if it had ever happened that a first-year student had cracked the mannequin right away. Arash Vent was silent for a moment. Then he said it had happened 3 times in 40 years. And all 3 were from great houses, and all 3 had been raised on elixirs since the age of 5. He said that Darren had been raised on gray porridge. Then he said one last thing. He said that if Darren cracked the mannequin today, he would become not a piece of trash to the rector, but a problem. He said that trash gets thrown out, but questions get answered, and that Dorn's answer might turn out to be worse than expulsion. He left. Darren remained seated. He pondered those words very carefully. Then he stood up and stepped out onto the white sand. The roar of the tears hit him like the wind. 2,000 people. The same faces, the same laughter. On the middle tier stood a woman in a red cloak, and she was laughing again. On the upper tier, in the trustees' box, sat people in furs. In the faculty box, Valian Dorn rose to his feet. He was wearing a white uniform and held his hands behind his back. He spoke loudly and evenly, and the entire arena could hear him. He said that the academy had given first-year student Darren Cole a 10-day suspension. He said that the suspension had expired. He said that the academy was fair and was therefore giving him the opportunity to prove his right to be here in front of everyone. He said that the condition was simple, a crack in the mannequin. He said that if there was no crack,
No one would ever again say that the Academy had expelled a person without giving him a chance. The stands roared with approval. A mannequin was rolled out from a side aisle. It stood on a low platform, black, smooth, cast from resin, life-sized, and twice as wide as a man. There were marks across its surface, hundreds of marks, dents, scratches, not a single crack. Darren walked up to it. He placed his palm on the black surface. The resin was warm and lifeless.
He stood there for about 10, and the whole arena was watching, and someone shouted for a stonemason to fix it. The stands burst into laughter. Darren withdrew his hand. Castlevaren stood at the very edge of the lower tier, looking down, and he wasn't laughing. Darren took a step back. He didn't know how to strike. No one had ever taught him. He thought of the beam. He thought of how he'd driven piles into the bottom of the moat with the heel of a hammer. Not with his hand, with his whole body, his legs, his back, his shoulder. A fist is just the end of a beam. He planted his feet. He exhaled. He struck. The sound wasn't what they'd expected. The tiers had been expecting a slap. A crack rang out. The mannequin swayed on the platform. It swayed all over. All 40 stones. Silence fell. It came so quickly that you could hear a bird crying somewhere far beyond the wall. Darren lowered his arm and looked at the mannequin. A crack ran across its black chest. It started at the point of impact and spread sideways and downward for 2 handspans. Tar-like dust crumbled out of it. Orash Vent stood by the tablet and raised his head very slowly. Valian Dorn did not move. Someone in the lower tier was the first to scream. Then everyone screamed. It wasn't the same roar as before. It was a different sound. There was no laughter in it. The woman in the red cloak stopped smiling and leaned forward. In the trustee's box, the man in furs stood up. Darren stood on the white sand, staring at the crack, and realized one thing very clearly. He shouldn't have done that. Orash Vent was right. He had just ceased to be trash. Valian Dorn raised his hand. The arena fell silent. The rector looked down at Darren for a very long time. Then he said that the Academy recognized the score. He said that freshman Darren Cole was officially enrolled. The stands erupted. Dorn paused and said one more thing, and his voice changed. He said that since the result had been confirmed, freshman Cole's responsibilities were the same as everyone else's. He said that in 2 decades, the 4th cohort would be heading out for the Air First field training. He said that Cole was going with him. He said where. He said that the cohort was heading to the clearing. Silence returned instantly. Darren didn't know what the clearing was. He saw the faces. He saw a guy on the lower tier grab the railing. He saw Castlevaren slowly turn his head toward the rector's box, and for the first time ever, something resembling confusion appeared on his face. Valian Dorn sat down. The inspection was over. Darren walked toward the tunnel and heard a single word creeping through the tiers behind him. The clearing. The clearing. The clearing. Orash Vent was waiting for him in the tunnel. The old man was pale. He didn't congratulate him. He said only one thing. He said that the clearing was a section of the boundary 4 days' journey away, that third-year students were taken there, and that last year, out of 32 third-year students, 19 had returned. He said that first-year students had never been sent there, not once in 120 years. Darren looked at him in silence. Orash Vent said that the rector had just killed 30 people to kill 1. He said that the entire 4th stream was heading to the clearing because of Darren. Darren stood in the tunnel and thought of the 300 sleeping in the 4th building who made him stronger every night. He asked how many people were in the stream. Orash Vent said 28. Darren nodded. He said that meant he had 2 decades. The old man asked what for. Darren turned and looked toward the tunnel exit, where the white sand of the arena lay. He said it was so that all 28 people would return. Dottie stepped out of the tunnel, and they were waiting for him. Not 3,
more than 20. The fourth group stood in the courtyard in a tight cluster, and they weren't laughing.
The first to step forward was a stocky guy with a scorched eyebrow. His name was Tarv Indri. He looked up at Darren because he was a head shorter, and he asked point blank if the stonemason knew what the clearing was. Darren replied that he didn't know. Tarv told him that the clearing was the place where the boundary came closest to the inhabited lands. He said there was no forest there because it had been burned down 200 years ago, and they wouldn't let it grow back. He said the empties roamed there. Darren asked what the empties were. The courtyard grew noisy. Someone said that this idiot didn't even know who they were being sent to fight. Tarv raised his hand, and everyone fell silent. He said that a void is what remains of a person taken by the boundary. He said they don't rot, they don't get tired, and they aren't afraid, and that they can't be scared or reasoned with. He said that third-year students go there in groups of 8 with 2 instructors, and that last year they lost 13. Then he said the most important thing. He said their class would pay the price for this. 28 people. Because of one person. Darren remained silent. A tall girl with a black braid pushed her way to the front. Her name was Mila Set. She said she didn't want to die just because someone had fixed the infirmary. She said that none of them had spent 3 years taking exams just to be fed to the empty ones in the very first 10 days. She said that if Darren had simply left when he was told to, none of this would have happened. The courtyard buzzed with murmurs. Everyone agreed. Darren stood there listening and made no excuses. Then he asked one question. He asked them how many of them had slept that night in the northern rooms of the fourth wing. The courtyard fell silent. Tarv Indri frowned and said he had slept there. He said it hadn't been cold for the first time in a month, and that everyone had assumed they were finally heating the building. Darren said they weren't heating it. He said it was the mortar. He said he'd gone through the mortar in the north and east walls in a single night. Mila Set looked at him, and her expression didn't change. She said that was very sweet, and that it wouldn't stop anyone from being dead in 2 decades. She turned and walked away. Almost everyone followed her. Tarv Indri stayed behind. He stood there looking at Darren and chewing on his lip. Then he said that the joints were actually not bad. Then he left too. Darren was left alone in the courtyard. He wasn't offended. He was thinking. He was thinking that they were all right. He thought about how, in 2 decades, 28 people would go to the place from which a third of the third-year class never returns. And that he knew nothing about the void or the boundary or how to fight. All he knew how to do was build. He raised his head and looked at the sign. Ankfuarid. Beitu. 164. And suddenly he realized he was looking at it the wrong way. All this time, he had been building to become stronger. He had viewed buildings as a source of numbers. But the numbers were just a side effect. The roof didn't give him a 1. The roof gave a person a dry night. The 1 came later. He stood in the courtyard, and something very big was slowly shifting in his mind. He wasn't a warrior whom the system fed with construction work. He was a builder, and strength was what the world gave him in return for what he had built. He turned around and walked to the infirmary. Ursa Mull was sitting by the new window, pinching a piece of paper. He sat down across from her and asked her what happens to people who return from the clearing. She stopped pinching. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said that last year they'd brought 9 of them to her. She said that 2 had died on the way because the journey took 4 days. She said that 3 had died under her care because she couldn't stop the infection from spreading. She said that 4 had survived, and one of them was lying over there in the corner without his right arm. Darren looked over at the corner. The guy without an arm was staring at the ceiling. Darren asked him his name. Irsa said his name was Hanno Vale, that he was a junior, and that after the clearing he hadn't spoken a word in 11 months. Darren stood up, walked over to his cot, and sat down on the floor beside him. He sat in silence. He didn't ask any questions. He sat there for an hour. Then he said aloud that in 2 decades his class would be heading to the clearing. 28 freshmen. Hanno Vale didn't move. Darren said he didn't know anything, that they would all die, and that he wanted them to come back. He said he was ready to listen for as long as it took. Then he fell silent and just sat there. About 20 minutes passed. Hanno Vale turned his head. He wasn't looking at Darren. He was staring at the wall. And he began to speak. His voice was like dry kindling. He said that it wasn't the empties who were killing them. He said the void ones were slow and stupid, and that any third-year student could take them one-on-one. He said it was the night that was killing them. He said you couldn't sleep in the clearing. He said there was nowhere to sleep there. That there wasn't a single wall or a roof for 9 leagues. He said the group drove stakes into the ground and lit a bonfire, with half keeping watch and half lying on the bare ground. He said that on the 3rd night, people stop understanding what they're seeing. He said that on the 4th, they start making mistakes. He said that Pustoy bit off his hand. He'd seen him but didn't believe his eyes because he hadn't slept for 80 hours. He fell silent. Then he said one last thing. He said that in Vyrubka, there are the remains of old guard posts. He said they were built back when the boundary was just being carved out. He said that all that remained of them were foundations and pieces of walls, and that groups gave them a wide berth because the empties nested in the ruins and because the walls might fall on their heads. He fell completely silent, turned away toward the wall, and didn't say another word. Darren sat on the floor of the infirmary and didn't move. Then he stood up and went out, and in the courtyard he stopped and looked east, where the boundary lay beyond the hills. His thoughts were crystal clear. There isn't a single roof left in the clearing. 28 people won't sleep for 4 nights, and on the 4th night they'll start making mistakes. Rector Dorn didn't send them there to face the void. He sent them to a place where there were no buildings. Darren clenched his fists. Then he unclenched them. Because there was something else in the clearing. There were foundations. He ran. He ran across the courtyard, and no one could have caught him, even on horseback. He burst into the first tower, where the library was, and stopped in front of the librarian, demanding everything they had on the boundary. Plans, maps, reports, everything. The librarian said that access to the boundary archives was restricted to 3rd-year students and above. Darren stood there looking at him. Then he left. He found Arash Vent in his room in the basement of the scroll hall. The old man was drinking an herbal tea. Darren said from the doorway that he needed the plans for the old guard posts in the clearing. Arash Vent set down his cup. He didn't ask why. He asked something else. He asked if the boy understood that if he began restoring the guard towers in the clearing, he would be repeating exactly what a man, who was later killed, had done 120 years ago. Darren replied that he understood. Arash Vent was silent for a long time. Then he stood up, walked over to the closet, and took out a flat made of black leather. He placed it on the table without opening it. He said that man's name was Ivar Renz. He said that after Renz rebuilt the watchtower at the boundary in a single decade, he didn't stop. He said that in 6 years, Renz had restored 11 guard posts and built a road, and that during those 6 years, not a single person had died in the section of the boundary where he worked. Not a single one. He said that Ivar Renz was then summoned to the capital to receive an award. He said that Renz set out. Darren asked what happened next. Arash Vent said nothing happened next. He said that Ivar Renz never made it to the capital. His body was never found. And within 3 years, the 11 guard towers fell into disrepair, and the sector began losing people again. He said that in the Academy's records, Ivar Renz is listed as having been expelled for poor academic performance. He placed his palm on the case. He said that this was the only thing left of him and that the old man had kept it for 40 years and never shown it to anyone. He slid the case toward Darren. He said that inside were the plans for the 11 guard posts, drawn by Renz's own hand. He said that 4 of them were in the clearing. Darren took the case. It was heavy. Orashvent told him one last thing. He said that Valiant Dorn had entered the academy 31 years ago. He said that before the academy, Dorn had been a Crown investigator. He said that Crown investigators don't become rectors just like that, and that the boy should think about who, 102 years ago, the man who had put an end to the deaths at the border. Darren stood there, the case in his hands. He asked quietly, "Who?" Orashvent sat back down at the table and picked up his cup. He said, "The one who gets paid for every person who dies at the border." He opened the case in the barn by candlelight. Inside lay 11 sheets of thick yellow paper, blueprints. Darren unfolded the first one and froze. He didn't know how to read blueprints. Darren Cole had hauled wagons and sounded out letters syllable by syllable, but he understood the lines on the paper instantly. He looked at them and saw a building. He saw where the load was applied, where the support was placed, and why the wall was exactly that thickness. He saw it as clearly as he had seen the crack in the mannequin before he struck it. The class did the work for him. He pored over the blueprints until morning. 4 sheets were marked in the corner with a single word: clear-cut, the northern wedge guard post, the 2 stones guard post, the dry riverbed guard post, the ridge guard post. Darren spread them out on the floor and looked down at them. And then he saw something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Ivar Renz wasn't drawing guard posts. He was drawing a line. The 4 points weren't located where it would be convenient, nor where the old foundation had been. They were positioned so that 2 of the neighboring outposts were visible from any one of them. Between them ran thin pencil strokes that Darren at first mistook for creases in the paper. They weren't creases. It was a road. Renz wasn't building 4 houses. He was building a grid. Darren sat on the floor and stared at it, and slowly, what he had suspected from the very beginning began to fall into place in his mind. The system treated each building separately: the roof, the floor, the infirmary, the walls. But what if the buildings could be connected? He didn't know. There wasn't a single line about it in the manual. He rolled up the blueprints and stepped outside at dawn. He had 13 days. He didn't head for the dump. He went to see Tarv Indri. The 4th stream lived in the north wing of the complex. Darren found Tarv in the courtyard, where he was striking a post with a wooden blade. Darren stood beside him and waited for him to finish. Tarv lowered the blade, looked at him from under his brows, and asked what he wanted. Darren said that there wasn't a single roof within 9 leagues of the clearing. Tarv froze. Darren said it wasn't the void that kills. It's the 4th night that kills. He said that on the 4th night, a man who hasn't slept for 80 hours sees the void and doesn't believe what he's seeing. Tarv Indri very slowly lowered his blade to the ground. He asked how Darren knew this. Darren said it was from Hanno Vale. Tarv turned pale. He said that Vale hadn't spoken in 11 months. Darren said he had. Tarv sat down on the ground right where he was standing. He sat there, staring at a single point. Then he said that his brother had been in last year's group. He didn't finish his sentence. Darren crouched down next to him and unfolded the blueprint in front of him. He said there were 4 old foundations in the clearing. He said that if they put a roof and walls on them, the stream would sleep for all 4 nights. He said that if the stream slept, the empties wouldn't touch them because any 3rd-year student could handle the empties, and they had 28 people. Tarv looked at the blueprint. He asked who had drawn it. Darren said it was the man who, 120 years ago, had ensured that no one died on his plot for 6 years. Tarv looked up. He asked what had happened to him. Darren looked him in the eyes and told the truth. He said he'd been killed. Tarv Indri was silent for a long time. Then he stood up, dusted off his knees, and said he needed to talk to the stream. Darren said he shouldn't talk to the stream. He said they needed manpower. He said that rebuilding the 4 guard posts while the group was stationed at Virupka was impossible, even for him. He said they shouldn't build there. They needed to build here. Tarv didn't understand. Darren explained. He said that a guardhouse couldn't be brought in, but everything needed to build it could be brought in. Beams marked and cut. Roof trusses pre-assembled. Jambs, posts. Everything disassembled and numbered. All that would be left to do on site was to lift and assemble them. He said that if the stream carried the lumber out in carts, they'd assemble the first guardhouse in a single daylight hour. Tarvindri stood there looking at him, opening and closing his mouth. Then he asked quietly, "How many beams are there?" Darren said that for 4 guardhouses it would be about 240. Tarv laughed. He laughed for almost a minute. Then he stopped and said that 28 freshmen wouldn't be able to saw 240 beams in 13 days, even if they didn't eat. Darren said that 28 would be enough, but not just 28. He said that 300 people lived in the 4th building. By evening, Tarv Indri had gathered a crowd in an empty lecture hall. 28 people. Mila Set sat in the back row with her arms crossed. Darren stood before them and didn't bother explaining anything about the system. He unfolded the blueprint and hung it on the board. He said one sentence. He said that no one sleeps in the clearing, and that's why people die there. Then he fell silent and let them look at the blueprint. Mila Set said from the back row that the mason was planning to build little houses for the empty ones. No one laughed. Tarv Indri turned to her and said that his brother had been in last year's group, that he died on the 5th day, and that the report listed it as a combat encounter. He said that now he knew his brother had simply gone 80 hours without sleep and hadn't seen what was coming at him. He said this in an even voice. The room grew very quiet. Mila Set dropped her hands. Darren said he needed 240 beams in 13 days. He said he couldn't give an order. He said he could only show them the blueprint. Then he left. He didn't stay to wait for an answer. He went to the workyard. The first ones arrived an hour later. Tarv brought 6 of them. They came in silently, took their saws, and stood by the saw benches. By midnight, there were 19 of them. In the morning, 4 more arrived from the work crew, along with 8 men from other crews whom Darren didn't know at all. He asked one of them why he had come. The guy shrugged and said he'd been sleeping in the north room, that it had gotten warm in there, and that he'd like to know why. By the 3rd day, 80 people were working in the farmyard. Darren hadn't slept. He marked each beam himself because no one but him could see where the load was going. He walked along the sawhorses, marking them with charcoal and telling them where to cut and at what angle. He made 4 mistakes in 13 days. The men sawed and tied the trusses together and stacked them. Darren numbered each one. By the 5th day, the stacks filled the entire yard. By the 7th day, the storekeeper arrived with a notepad. He stood there for a moment. He looked at the 80 people and the stacks. Then he walked over to Darren and said very quietly that behind the stable, on the dump, there was scrap lumber left over from the renovation of the 3rd tower, that it had been lying there for 6 years, and that if someone took it, no one would notice. He said he hadn't said anything. He left. On the 8th day, people from the rector's office arrived. 2 men in gray uniforms. They counted the stacks. They asked Darren on what grounds the material was being seized. Darren said the material had been written off. They made a note of it. They left. Tarv Indri watched them leave and said that this was bad. Darren nodded. On the 9th day, Ursa Mole brought a cauldron of hot stew into the courtyard, and 80 people ate standing up. On the 11th day, Casselveran came into the courtyard. He came alone. He stood off to the side and watched the freshmen assemble a truss. He stood there for nearly an hour. Darren approached him on his own. Castle didn't turn his head. He said his father was on the board of trustees. He said that yesterday, at the board meeting, they had discussed the 4th stream. He said the question had been framed strangely. He said they hadn't been discussing sending people to the clearing. They'd been discussing how many casualties to consider acceptable. Darren remained silent. Castle said the number had been set in advance. He said they'd set it at 21. 21 out of 28. He said that at the council meeting, they called it the projected casualty rate and that no one objected. He said his father didn't object either. Then he turned and looked Darren in the face. He said he didn't understand how it was possible to set a casualty rate before deployment. He said he'd been studying here for 2 years and had always thought the academy was at war with the boundary. He said he wasn't sure anymore. Then he left. On the night of the 12th day, Darren stood by the stack and counted 231 beams. He wasn't keeping up. He was 9 short. He grabbed a saw and walked to the trestles alone. He sawed all night. By dawn, 6 others were standing beside him. He hadn't noticed when they'd arrived. By noon on the 13th day, there were 240 numbered beams and 32 bundled trusses lying in the yard, all covered with burlap. Darren stood there, looking at it. The sign hadn't given him a single point. Not one. The lumber wasn't a building. No one was using it. He looked at the 13 days of his life turned into dead pieces of wood, and at the 80 people collapsing from exhaustion all around him. And he suddenly realized that in all 13 days, he hadn't once thought about numbers. On the morning of the 14th day, the 4th cohort left the academy gates. 28 freshmen, 4 wagons, 2 accompanying instructors, and 1.5 metric tons of numbered lumber under the burlap dot. The journey took 4 days. Darren walked alongside the lead wagon, watching the landscape change. On the 2nd day, the fields ended. On the 3rd, the forest ended. On the 4th, everything ended. The clear cut began abruptly. One moment there was brown grass, and suddenly it was gone. From there to the horizon lay ash-colored earth. Flat. Bare. Not a single tree in sight. Here and there, black stumps as thick as a barrel jutted out, and they hadn't rotted away in 200 years. The sky above the clearing was lower than anywhere else. Darren stopped at the edge and looked out. No one spoke. 28 people stood there, gazing at 9 leagues of emptiness. The accompanying instructor was a wiry man named Audric Fenn, and he had led the 3rd-year class to the clearing 9 times. He told the group that it was a 2-hour walk to the first marker. He said they would set the stakes before dark. He said they would take turns sleeping. Milasette asked him where they would sleep. He looked at her and said on the ground. She asked where they would sleep if it rained. He said they wouldn't sleep if it rained. He said this without malice. He said it like a man who had done this 9 times before. Tarv Indri looked at Darren. Darren was silent. He recognized the first marker 300 paces away. The northern wedge. He knew the blueprint by heart. He saw what everyone else had mistaken for rocks. The rectangle of the foundation, 22 paces by 14. The masonry had survived to knee height. Weeds grew inside, and 200-year-old debris lay scattered about. On the west side stood a section of wall as tall as a man, with an opening. Audric Fenn ordered them to go around it. He said that the Void Ones nest in ruins. Darren said they didn't. Everyone turned to look at him. Darren said that the Void Ones don't nest in ruins. He said that the Void Ones go where people used to be. He said the ruins were empty because no one had been there for 200 years. Audric Fenn asked him how he knew that. Darren didn't answer. He didn't know how. He just looked at the foundation and figured it out. Audric Fenn spat and said he had orders from the rector not to stand in the way of Freshman Cole's initiative. He said this with a look on his face that made it clear how he felt about the order. He said he was giving Darren 1 daylight hour. He said that if nothing had been done by nightfall, the bridge would be erected on its piles as it should be. Darren was already heading toward the foundation. He worked harder than he ever had before. He pulled out the weeds with his bare hands. He ran his palm over the masonry and found 4 spots where it had settled. He ordered them to unload the carts. No one moved. Then, Tarv Indri picked up the first beam and carried it by himself. 6 others followed him. Then 8 more. Milasette stood watching, not moving. Darren marked the ground with charcoal. He marked the spots for the posts. He lifted the beams himself and placed them in sockets and held them in place while 2 others wedged them in. He lifted, one by one, what 4 men together could not lift. 264 tella. No one asked why a freshman was hauling what a horse couldn't lift. Everyone was too busy. By 3 o'clock, 8 posts were standing. By 5, the joists were in place. By 7, they'd raised the first truss, and all 28 men were pulling it with ropes, and it snapped into place with a click and it fit perfectly. Tarvindri stood there with a rope in his hands, looking up, and he laughed. He laughed so hard he sat down on the ground. Then everyone got to work. Milasette arrived at 8 o'clock, silently picked up a board and carried it away. Darren didn't say anything to her. The sun was setting when the last piece of lathing was laid. There was no roof. There was just a framework of rafters. Darren told them to cover it with matting. They tied down the matting in the dark, feeling their way. There were no walls. There was 1 old west wall and 3 open sides. Darren said the walls would be built tomorrow. He said today was for the roof. Aldrich Fenn walked over, looked up, and was silent for a long time. Then he asked Darren how many years the boy had been learning to build. Darren said 14 days. Aldrich Fenn looked at him and didn't answer. It rained that night. 28 people lay on the packed earth beneath the matting on the rafters inside the 200-year-old foundation. The rain pounded the matting and ran down the old west wall, not getting inside. Someone by the wall said aloud that it was dry. No one answered. A minute later, the first one fell asleep. The display flashed. Usage recorded. Shelter, 1 user, body +1. Darren sat at the entrance with his back to the wall and watched. Body +2. Body +1. Body +3. 28 people fell asleep one after another, and he sensed each one. And then another one came. New entry, line .1. A 4, form incomplete. Darren stopped breathing. He stared at the line that hadn't been there before. A line point. 1 of 4. Form. He turned his head and looked west into the darkness, where, 6 leagues from here, stood the foundation of the 2 stones. Ivar Renz wasn't building guard posts. He was building one thing. And the system knew it. Darren sat there until morning, not closing his eyes once, and didn't notice it. In the morning, 28 people woke up and got to their feet, and they were different people. Aldrich Fenn looked at them, and his face showed something resembling bewilderment. He had taught the 3rd course 9 times, and by the 2nd morning, his people were already gray. These ones were pink. Milasette approached Darren on her own. She stood there in silence and then said she'd slept for 6 hours. She said it as if she were reporting a miracle. Then she asked him directly where the 2nd waypoint was. Darren unfolded the map. He said it was 6 leagues to the west. He said that if they left now, they'd have time to raise the rafters before dark. Tarvindri was already heading toward the wagons. Everyone followed him. Aldrich Fenn stood in the middle of the clearing and watched as 28 freshmen hitched the wagons without being ordered to. Then he went after them. They erected 2 stones in a day. Dry riverbed in a day and a half. The ridge took 2 days because they ran out of fasteners, and Darren set the posts in place and the clearing without a single nail. He did this for the first time in his life and didn't make a single mistake. By the 9th day, there were 4 guardhouses standing in the clearing. Roofs, 3 walls on each. 2 tiered plank bunks. A hearth with a chimney. Darren always built the hearth last, and always by himself. He laid the stones dry and channeled the smoke through an opening, and when the first hearth in Sukhoi Russell burned down to a steady glow and 8 men held out their hands toward it, the tablet gave him 12 kows. He was no longer surprised. He had already fully grasped the rule. The system didn't pay for the stone. It paid for that moment when a person felt better. And that's why it paid for the same building all over again every night. The guard posts operated like a mine. Darren looked at the numbers, and they no longer fit in his head. Body 1,190. Move 1,004, 120. Bark 360. Return 9. He didn't feel any stronger. He felt well rested. The empties arrived on the 10th night. There were 9 of them. They emerged from the ashes from the east and headed straight for the fire of the northern wedge. Darren saw them first because he was standing on the roof. He looked down and realized that Hanno Vale hadn't lied. The empties were slow. They looked like people who'd been held underwater for a very long time. Their skin was like wet paper. Their eyes were open and unblinking. They didn't growl. They walked in silence, and that was worse than a growl. Audric Fenn raised the alarm. 28 men came out of the guardhouse and lined up in front of the opening. They had slept for 9 nights in a row. They held their blades steady.
Audric Fenn looked at them, and something in his expression changed irrevocably. He said only to strike at the knee and then at the neck. The fight lasted 4 minutes. 28 well-rested freshmen dispatched the 9 empties without losing a single man. Tarv injury took down 2. Mila Set severed the third's neck with a single swing and then stood over him. She was shaking, but she stood her ground. Darren didn't come down from the roof. He didn't land a single blow. He watched from above, counting, and realized that this was the answer. It wasn't his job to kill. His job was to make sure those who'd slept were the ones doing the killing. Audric Fenn approached him when it was all over. He stood below, looking up. He said that over the course of 9 sorties, he'd lost 26 men. He said all 26 had died after the 3rd night. He said that all 9 times he'd written combat engagement in his report because that's what he was ordered to write. Then he fell silent for a long time. Then he said that if someone had put roofs on these buildings 20 years ago, those 26 men would still be alive. He asked Darren why no one had put them on. Darren looked down at him from above and said that they had been installed 120 years ago. Audric Fenn didn't understand. Darren had shown him the blueprint that morning. Audric Fenn stared at it for a long time and then asked whose hand had drawn it. Darren said it was Avra Rensa's. Audric Fenn turned so pale that it was visible even beneath his stubble. He said he knew that name. He said that in the basement of the garrison in the Boundary, there was a stone from the old guardhouse with that name carved into it, and that no one knew who it was, and that they didn't throw the stone away because of a superstition. Darren asked him if any of the foundations were still standing. Audric Fenn said there were some all over the Boundary. He said there were hundreds of them. He said people had been avoiding them for 200 years. On the 11th day, Darren set out alone. He left before dawn and told no one. He ran. 1,400 steps carried him through the clearing so that the ash rose behind him like a wall. He covered 9 li in an hour and a half. He reached the spot he was looking for on the map. On the last sheet of Renz's map, there was an unnamed dot. It wasn't in the clearing. It was beyond it. It wasn't a guard post. Darren arrived and stopped. A pit lay before him. Round, about 40 steps across. Its edges were lined with hewn stone, and the stone had been untouched for 2 centuries. There was nothing at the bottom of the pit. No debris, no weeds, no ash, just bare stone. Darren climbed down. He walked across the bottom and placed his palm on the masonry. The plaque lit up on its own. He hadn't built it. He hadn't repaired it. He had simply touched it. Node detected. Form of Avar Renz, completed at 11 out of 11. Caddy. Form ripped apart from the outside. Date of rip unknown. Darren stood at the bottom of the pit and read this. He read it 6 times. The form was completed at 11 out of 11. Renz finished it. He finished everything. 11 guard posts and this knot. And then the structure was torn apart from the outside. Darren slowly raised his head and looked at the edges of the pit. And then he saw what he hadn't noticed at first. The masonry along the edge hadn't crumbled. It had been chiseled away.
Neat chips. Tool marks. Someone had come here with people and pickaxes and deliberately destroyed the very top ring of masonry all around the circumference. 200 years ago. Darren sat at the bottom of the pit for a very long time. Then he said aloud into the void that he understood now. Orash Vent had said that after Renz's death, the 11 guard posts had fallen into disrepair within 3 years. Orash Vent was wrong. The guard posts hadn't fallen into disrepair. They'd been dismantled. Someone had taken great care to ensure that Ivar Renz's form ceased to exist. And that someone knew what it was. Darren climbed out of the pit and headed back. He walked the whole way. He thought the entire time. He returned by evening. They were waiting for him at the northern wedge. Not a crowd. 8 horsemen in gray cloaks stood by the guardhouse, and with them stood Audric Fenn, his face as stern as stone. The senior horseman dismounted, approached Darren, and asked if he was the first-year student Darren Cole. Darren said yes. The horseman unfolded a piece of paper and read it aloud. He said that first freshman Darren Cole was summoned to the capital. He said the summons was signed by the Crown Chancellery. He said the reason for the summons was an award for the initiative he had shown at the border. He rolled up the paper. He said they would leave at dawn tomorrow. Darren stood there looking at him. Behind the horseman, Audric Fenn very slowly shook his head once. Darren recalled the words of Orash Vent. Ivar Renz had been summoned to the capital for an award. Renz set out. Renz never arrived. His body was never found. Darren looked at the gray horsemen. There were 8 of them, and not a single one looked him in the... He smiled and said it was a great honor for him. That night, Tarv Indri came to see him. He sat down next to him by the wall and remained silent, then said that Audric Fenn had told him about Renz. He said that the stream would not let Darren go. He said that 28 men would stand at the gates. Darren said that in that case, 28 men would die for disobeying the crown. He said the summons had been signed by the Chancellery and that it was not an invitation. Tarv said that in that case, Darren would die alone. Darren replied that he would not. He said that Renz was a scribe and a draftsman and a man in the field. He said that Renz did not have 264 bodies. He said this carelessly. Tarv Indri didn't understand the words, but understood the tone. He asked quietly who Darren Cole was. Darren was silent for a long time. Then he said he didn't know. He said he'd opened his eyes 18 days ago in the allocation arena, and that before that, he remembered nothing except other people's memories. He said this to the first person in this world. Tarv Indri sat beside him, motionless. Then he said it didn't change anything. He said a person isn't a memory. A person is what he builds. He stood up and left. Darren remained seated, watching him go, and thought that this was the wisest thing he'd heard in 18 days. They set out at dawn. 8 horsemen and 1 wagon. Darren was put in the wagon. They didn't tie him up. They treated him politely. The leader introduced himself as Haldrain and said the journey would take 6 days. Darren sat in the wagon, watching the road and counting the days. On the 3rd day, the road turned. Darren could tell by the position of the sun. He asked Haldrain why they were heading south when the capital was to the west. Haldrain said it was a detour because of flooding. Darren looked up at the sky. It hadn't rained for 12 days. He nodded and said he understood. He didn't sleep that night. On the 4th day, they entered a devastated city. Darren didn't know what it was. He saw the walls. He saw the breaches. He leaned out of the wagon and looked. The city was dead. The streets were littered with debris. The roofs had caved in. The wall stood in pieces. Haldrain said this was Lockmar and that it had been captured 12 years ago and wasn't being rebuilt because there was no point. Darren asked if people lived here. Haldrain laughed and said no. He was wrong. Darren saw smoke, a thin wisp, coming from a basement. He saw a pen behind the ruins with 2 goats inside. He saw laundry hanging on a line. He said nothing. The wagon pulled up in the square at the center of the dead city. Haldrein said they'd spend the night here. Darren got out. He looked around very carefully. 8 horsemen stood in a circle. Not a single one had unsaddled his horse. Not a single one had lit a fire. Darren looked at the square. He chose a spot. He sat down on a rock with his back to the remains of the wall so that the rock was behind him. Haldrein approached him and sat down across from him on a corner point. He was a calm man with a weary face. He said there was one thing the boy should know. He said he didn't like this job. He said he'd done it 4 times in 11 years, and that each time it had involved very young people. Darren asked him how much he'd been paid. Haldrein said it wasn't about the money. He said he had an order, and that the order hadn't been signed by the rector or the trustees. Darren asked who had signed it. Haldrein said that this information would no longer be of any use to the boy. Then he added one more thing, and there was something like regret in his voice. He said he didn't understand why the boy had been building. He said that for 11 years he had been transporting contracts to the border. He said that every year the Crown allocated funds to fortify the boundary. He said the money went through the houses. He said the houses reported their losses. He said the more losses there were, the larger the treasury allocation for the following year. He fell silent. Darren sat and watched him, and the final piece of the puzzle fell into place in his mind. He said aloud that if people stopped dying at the border, the treasury allocation would stop. Haldrein didn't answer. He stood up and said it was a shame. He walked away. Darren watched his back. 8 men. He didn't know how to fight. He'd punched a mannequin once in his life. He looked at the sign. Body 1,190. He looked at the ruins all around him. Then he raised his head and looked at the smoke rising from the basement. He stood up and said loudly that before he died, he'd like to sleep under a roof. Haldrein turned around. Darren pointed to a gap in the wall of the house across the street. He said it was dry in there. Haldrein looked at his men. Then he shrugged and said, "Until dawn." Darren walked into the ruins. He wasn't planning to sleep. He walked right through and emerged on the other side, finding himself in an alley. He didn't run. He headed toward the smoke. The basement was beneath a bakery. The hatch was blocked with planks, and Darren pushed them aside with one hand, making no sound. It was warm down there. Down there, fat was burning in a pot. 11 people were sitting down there, women, 4 children, 2 old people. They looked up at him and no one screamed. So they knew how not to scream. The woman with a strand of gray hair stood up first. She was holding a kitchen knife. Darren crouched down by the hatch so he wouldn't be taller than her. He said he wouldn't hurt them. He said there were 8 crown riders upstairs and that they'd leave in the morning. The woman said they knew. She said they spent the night here once a year and that they always waited for them to leave. She said that 12 years ago, 11,000 people lived here. She said there were now 40 of them. She said they lived in the basements because there wasn't a single intact wall upstairs. Darren asked why they hadn't left. The woman looked at him as if he were a fool. She said this was their city. Darren crouched by the manhole of the dead city of Lochmar and looked at the 40 people living in the basements, and something clicked into place in his head with such a distinct click that he could almost hear the sound. He told her he'd be back. She said everyone says that. He went upstairs before dawn, lay down in the breach, and pretended to be asleep. In the morning, they set out. Darren sat in the wagon, watching Lochmar recede into the distance and memorizing every breach in the wall. On the 6th day, the road entered a gorge. Haldrein halted the column. He dismounted, walked over to the wagon, and said very calmly, almost gently, that they would have to continue on foot. Darren climbed out. He looked around. A gorge, a scree slope. Not a single witness for 10 leagues. 8 men stood in a semicircle. Haldrain drew his blade and said that the boy wouldn't feel any pain. Darren looked at the 8 men. Then he looked at Haldrain and said one sentence. He asked if he knew how many people had slept that night in the northern wedge. Haldrain didn't understand. Darren said 28. He said that a garrison patrol, which had been alerted by the smoke, was sleeping in 2 stones. He said that in Dry Channel and on the ridge, too, there were someone there, because in the boundary, news of the roof travels faster than a horseman. He said that right now about 60 men were sleeping in his guard posts. He smiled and said that each of them was making him stronger right at that moment, even as they stood there talking. Haldrain froze. He didn't understand a word, but he understood the look on his face. He shouted for them to attack. 2 went first. Darren saw them so slowly that he had time to notice one of them swallow hard. 1,420 steps. He stepped aside, and the first one passed by. Darren grabbed his blade-wielding hand without breaking it. He wrenched the blade from his fingers and flung it into the scree. He placed his palm against the second man's chest. He didn't strike. He pushed. The man flew 9 paces, fell, and didn't get up right away. 1,190 body. Darren stood in the middle of the gorge, and 8 men of the crown stared at him, motionless. Haldrain lowered his blade. He said very quietly that this sort of thing never happens. He said the boy was 18. Darren said it wasn't about the boy. He said it was about these 60 sleepers. Then he stepped right up close to Haldrain and told him he wouldn't kill him. Haldrain said that in that case, his own people would kill him. Darren said he knew. He said that was why Haldrain now had a choice that Ivar Rens hadn't had. He asked him if he knew that name. Haldrain stood there for a very long time, silent. Then he said that name was in his family book. He said his great-great-grandfather had served in the Crown's convoy 120 years ago. He said that one thing had been passed down in their family. He said that before his great-great-grandfather died, he'd said he'd killed the man who built the road, and that the road had disappeared afterward, and that he didn't understand why he'd been paid for it. Darren looked at him. Then he asked who had signed the order. Haldrain took a folded sheet from his bosom and held it out. Darren unfolded it. At the bottom was the seal of the Crown Chancellery, and beneath it, a signature. Darren stared at it and didn't immediately realize what he was seeing. There was only one signature, Valian Dorn, and beneath it, in parentheses, was his title, not Rector. Treasurer of the Borderlands. Darren held the sheet and stared at the signature. Treasurer of the Borderlands. He reread the title 3 times. Then he asked Haldrain what it meant. Haldrain said it was a position that didn't appear in the public records. He explained that the Treasury Steward of the Boundary received reports on losses from all sections of the border, and based on those reports, the Chancellery allocated funds to the houses for the following year. He said the position was held for life, and that it was appointed not by the Crown, but by the Board of Trustees. Darren raised his head very slowly. He said aloud that the Academy's rector decides how much money the houses will receive, and that the houses elect the rector. Haldrain said that was correct. Darren stood in the gorge with the paper in his hand, and finally saw the entire structure in its entirety. The Academy did not train fighters. The Academy trained casualties. 21 out of 28. The projected loss, assigned in advance, was not cruelty. It was a budget. He folded the sheet and tucked it into his shirt. Haldrain looked at him and then said that if Darren returned, he would die. He said that Dorn would simply sign a second order and send not 8, but 40. Darren asked him what would happen to him. Haldrain said that he had disobeyed the order and that he had a 7-year-old daughter in the suburbs. He said this matter-of-factly. Darren looked at the remaining 7. They stood there without raising their weapons. One was sitting on the scree, clutching his chest. Darren told them all one thing. He said that 4 days' journey from here lay the dead city of Lockmar, where 40 people lived in the basements. He said he was going to rebuild it. He said he needed helpers and that he wasn't asking who they were or what they'd done before. He said that whoever went with him would have a roof over their head. Haldrain laughed hoarsely and said it was the strangest offer he'd ever heard in his life. Then he looked at his men. No one moved. Darren nodded and set off. He walked past them, and no one raised a hand. He took 20 steps and heard footsteps behind him. He didn't turn around. He heard a second person start walking, then a third. By evening, 4 were following him. Haldrain led the way. Darren never once asked why. He already knew. The people who had been herding the young ones through the gorges for 11 years also wanted to sleep peacefully someday. They reached Lockmar in 3 days. Darren entered the city in the middle of the day and made no attempt to hide. He walked to the square, stood in the center, and remained. An hour later, a woman with a strand of gray hair emerged from the basement. She stood by the hatch, looking at him and the 4 crown horsemen behind him, and her face was expressionless. Darren said he had returned. She said she could see that. He said he had come to build. She said she had 40 people, 18 of whom were children and the elderly, and that if he had brought the crown, he should just kill them right away. Darren sat down on a rock in the middle of the square and said he hadn't brought the crown. He said he'd brought 4 masons who didn't know about it yet. Haldrain, standing behind him, said he wasn't a mason. Darren said he was already a mason. He started that very day. He didn't start with the wall. He started with 2 houses on the east side where the masonry was 2/3 complete. He broke out the rotten floor joists and installed new ones made from beams salvaged from a dismantled bakery. He roofed them with tiles he'd collected off the streets one by one. A woman with a strand of gray hair stood watching as an 18-year-old boy single-handedly lifted a beam that 4 men couldn't lift. She didn't ask anything. He finished the first house on the 4th day. He went down to the basement and said that it was dry upstairs and that there were 4 rooms. No one went up. They lived in the basements for 12 years. Upstairs was death. Then the woman with a strand of gray hair was the first to climb out. Her name was Vesta Horn. She went up into the house, walked through all 4 rooms, and touched the walls. Then she came back down and led the 4 children upstairs. That night, 6 people slept in the house on the east side of Lockmar. The sign lit up. Body plus 6. Darren sat in the square and watched the light in the window of the dead city. By the 10th day, all 40 were living upstairs. Darren had rebuilt 11 houses. He worked 20 hours a day. Haldrain and the 4 of them hauled stone. The old people sorted roof tiles. The children carried shingles. Darren taught them on the job and discovered he had a knack for teaching. He'd demonstrate something once, and people would understand. That was a class in itself. On the 12th day, he set to work on the well. The town well had been filled in during the assault. Darren spent 4 days clearing stones from it and emerged covered in soot. When he lifted the first bucket of clean water and Vestahorn drank from it, the tablet immediately gave him 8 Korra, and he realized that water, too, was an illusion. On the 16th day, strangers arrived. 11 people with a wagon. They came from the south and stopped by the breach, watching the smoke rising from the chimneys. Their leader asked Vestahorn if it was true that they offered shelter here. Vesta looked at Darren. Darren said it was true. He asked who they were. The leader said they were from Broda. He said that Broda had been taken 6 years ago, that they lived in the forest, and that half of them died every winter. Darren told them to stay. A month later, there were 190 people living in Lockmar. They had come on their own. The rumor of a town where houses were being rebuilt spread across the ravaged lands faster than a horseman. They came from cellars. They came from the woods. They came in families. Darren turned no one away. He built from dawn until dusk, and then built by torchlight. He erected 40 houses.
He built 3 communal hearths. He restored the mill on the stream, and when the first sack of flour came out from under the millstones, the display showed him a message he had never seen before. Use recorded. Food. Body plus 19. He stared at the numbers, and they ceased to be numbers. Body 4,800. Progress 2,100. Bark 1,900. Return 43. He checked the return by accident. He slid his palm to the bone on a broken stone. He looked at the wound, and it closed in 11 seconds. He stood there looking at his clean palm and felt nothing but fatigue. On the 40th day, he set to work on the wall. Lockmar's city wall had 3 breaches. Darren started with the eastern one because that was where they had come from 12 years ago. He laid the stones himself. He worked for 12 hours a day, and 190 men passed stones to him in a human chain, hand to hand. He closed the eastern breach in 9 days. He laid the last stone at sunset, climbed down, stepped back, and looked at the wall. The plaque was silent. Darren waited. Nothing. He stood there, unable to understand. The wall stood. It was real. And the system hadn't given a single unit. Vestahorn walked over, stood beside him, and asked why he looked that way. Darren said that no one had used the wall yet. She looked at him as if he were crazy. Then she said one sentence that made Darren's throat tighten. She said that tonight, for the first time in 12 years, she would fall asleep without listening to the east. That night, the sign flashed. Use recorded. Fence. 190 users. Bark plus 190. New line opened. Armor unit. Darren sat down right on the ground, the 5th line. He raised his hand and looked at it but saw nothing. Then he picked up a sharp shard from the ground and ran it along his forearm. The shard slid right through. The skin didn't tear. He pressed harder and the shard broke. He sat on the ground of the dead city, staring at his hand, and realized that the wall doesn't work when people are hiding behind it. The wall works when people sleep behind it, paying no heed to the east. On the 50th day, he closed the 2nd breach. On the 58th, the 3rd. On the night the wall of Lockmar closed, the tablet gave him what he had been waiting for. 60 days. Form. Lockmar.
Closed on 1 of 1. Target outline. Darren stood on the wall and looked down at the city. 40 houses, a mill, a well, 3 hearths, the wall. And all of this lay beneath him like a blueprint. He saw the lines. He saw how the houses were positioned relative to the gates. He saw that the street leading from the eastern gate did not run straight, but took a sharp turn, and that this turn would lead anyone entering directly to the wall of a house with a blind end. He hadn't built it that way on purpose. He'd built it as he saw it. And now, looking down from above, he realized he hadn't built a city. He'd built a trap. He remembered Renz's blueprints. 11 points and the lines connecting them. The shape. He sat down on the wall and stayed there until morning. In the morning, horsemen appeared on the road. Darren saw them from the tower 2 leagues away. There were 40 of them. A banner led the way. Haldrain climbed up to him, looked, and his face turned ashen. He said it was a convoy from the Chancellery. He said they were coming for him. Darren stared at the road and said nothing. Then he asked Haldrain how many people he had in the city. Hald said there were 190, and that 8 of them were men capable of wielding pitchforks. Darren nodded. He climbed down from the wall and walked toward the gate. Vestahorn caught up with him in the square, grabbed his sleeve, and said that if he went out, they would kill him, and that then the 190 people would have to crawl back into the basements. Darren stopped. He looked at her. Then he looked at the city he had built in 60 days. He told her he wasn't going to go out. He said that for the first time in his entire life, he was standing on the inside. He climbed onto the wall above the gate and waited. 40 horsemen rode up to 100 paces away and halted. One broke away from them, rode closer, and raised his head. Darren looked down and recognized him. Below, on horseback in a white uniform, sat Valian Dorn. Valian Dorn sat on his horse, looking up and remained silent. He looked for a long time. He wasn't looking at Darren. He was looking at the wall. He had ridden here for 4 days, and all that time his reports had stated that Lokmar was a ruin with 3 breaches. Before him stood a solid wall, 3 men high. He shifted his gaze to the tower above the gate. It was new. He looked at the smoke rising from 40 chimneys. Then he finally raised his head and looked at the boy in the tattered jacket standing on his own wall. He said loudly that first-year student Darren Cole had failed to report to the capital when summoned by the Chancellery. He said that this constituted desertion. Darren replied that he would have come if the summons had been for an award. He said that the summons was for a murder and that he had seen the signature. It grew very quiet below. The 40 horsemen sat motionless. Dorn's expression did not change. He said he did not understand what was being discussed. Darren took a folded sheet of paper from his bosom, unfolded it, and held it out at arm's length. He did not shout about the signature. He did something else. He said aloud, so that all 40 could hear, that this bore the seal of the Chancellery and the signature of the Treasurer of the Boundary, and that this treasurer was now sitting downstairs on a white horse, wearing the uniform of the Academy's rector. He said it would be interesting to find out how many of the 40 downstairs knew that their rector was counting money for the dead. Not a single horseman stirred, but Darren saw what he was looking for. 2 of them exchanged glances. Valian Dorn realized it too. He didn't argue. He did something Darren hadn't expected. He dismounted. He dropped the reins and walked toward the gate alone, stopping at the wall and raising his head. He said the boy could come down and talk, or stay up there and listen. From above, it didn't matter to him either way. Darren came down. He stepped out through the gate alone and stood before the rector. He was half a head taller than him. Valian Dorn looked up at him, and there was neither malice nor fear in his eyes. There was only weariness. He said that Darren didn't understand anything. He said that he himself had been at the Boundary 29 years ago. He said he'd seen Broda burn to the ground and watched as they took Lokmar. He said that after Lokmar, he'd gone to the Chancellery and asked for money for the walls, and they'd refused him. He said that nobody cared about the walls. He said that back then he'd realized one thing the boy hadn't yet grasped. He said that the Treasury only pays for blood. He said you could spend 20 years writing petitions and get nothing, or you could lose 26 men and get Treasury funds for the entire sector. He said that all the money that had come to the Boundary over the past 30 years had come through casualty reports. He said that every dead third-year student meant 2 towers. Darren looked at him and didn't interrupt. Dorn spoke, and his voice grew harsher. He said he wasn't a murderer. He said he was an accountant. He said that every year he signed off on a budget, and in that budget there was a line item for losses, and that he haggled over every figure. He said that 21 out of 28 wasn't a death sentence for the stream. It was the price he'd quoted the council to secure funding for the next 5 years. He said that if he'd quoted 6, he wouldn't have gotten anything, and in 2 years the limit would have been breached, and not 21 but 40,000 would have died. He fell silent. Then he said one last thing, and it was spoken almost like a human being. He said that the boy, with his rooftops, would now wipe out the deficit across the entire sector. He said that if the 4th stream returned in full, next year's Treasury allocation for the Boundary would be cut in half. He said that then, in 3 years, the entire Boundary would die. He said that he hadn't killed Wrens and that Rensa had been killed by those same numbers. Darren stood there in silence for a very long time. Then he asked him one question. He asked who would receive the Treasury funds. Dorn froze. Darren said he understood everything the rector had said. He said he understood the arithmetic. He said there was one thing he didn't understand. He said that if the Treasury had been going to the frontier for 30 years through loss reports, Then in 30 years, the frontier should be lined with towers stretching to the horizon. He said he had been to the clearing. He said that there wasn't a single roof. He said that in the 29 years of Valiandorn's service on the border, nothing had been built. He said the money came in every year. He asked where it was going. Valiandorn stood there and said nothing. And then Darren saw something he never expected to see. He saw the man in the white uniform turn pale. Dorn opened his mouth and closed it. He turned his head and looked at his 40 horsemen. Then he looked at the wall of Lockmar. The wall still stood. A boy had built it in 9 days out of broken stone, without a single coin. Dorn stared at it, and something in his face broke. He said very quietly that the treasury was going to the houses. Darren said he knew. Dorn said that the houses reported their accounts through contracts. Darren said he'd seen the contracts. He said he'd ridden through the boundary for 4 days and hadn't seen a single one. He said that for 30 years, Valiandorn had haggled over the loss figures and sold living people to get money that was distributed to the houses of the trustees that very same day and never reached the border. He said that the rector wasn't an accountant. He said that the rector was a supplier. Valiandorn stood beneath the wall of the dead city and said nothing. Then he asked very quietly who had taught the boy to think that way. Darren said no one. He said he simply builds, and that's why he knows how much a wall costs. He said that the wall of Lockmar cost 60 days and 0 coins, and that if even a tenth of the treasury had reached the boundary over 30 years, there would be 200 such walls standing there. Dorn closed his eyes. He stood like that for about 10 seconds. Then he opened them, and he was a different man. He said he would give the boy one piece of advice, and that it was the first honest advice he'd given in 30 years. He said Darren needed to run. He said he would turn the convoy around right now and write in his report that Lockmar was empty. He said that would buy them 3 weeks. He said that after that, it wouldn't be him coming here. Darren asked who it would be. Valiandorn said one word. He said, the House of Varen. Darren didn't understand right away. Then he did. Castle Varen. Second-year student, top of his class. Dorn said that the House of Varen had held the contracts for fortifying the boundary for 22 years. He said that all the money goes through them. He said that the head of the Varen house, Ortan Varen, is the man whose signature is on every contract, a man no one has ever seen. He said that Ortan Varan is the one who, 120 years ago, through the mouth of his great-grandfather, ordered the dismantling of the 11 guard posts of Ivar Renz. He said that the Varan house would not send 40 horsemen. The House of Varan will send war. He turned and walked toward his horse. Halfway there, he stopped and, without turning around, said one more thing. He said that in 30 years, not a single person had asked him where the treasury's funds went. He said the boy had asked within the first 2 minutes. Then he mounted his horse and led the convoy away. Darren stood by the wall and watched them ride away. Behind him, Vestahorn climbed down from the wall. She walked over, stood beside him, and said she'd heard everything. Darren remained silent. She asked him what would happen now. He looked east, where 4 days' journey away lay the clearing and his 4 guard posts. He thought about Renz's diagram. 11 points and the lines connecting them. The shape was torn apart from the outside. He suddenly realized that Renz hadn't built the guard posts so that people could sleep. He'd built them to bind them together. And he wasn't killed because they had stopped dying. He was killed because he had almost closed the loop. Darren turned to Vestahorn and said he needed everyone who could walk. He said they had to remove everything from Lockmar that wasn't nailed down. She asked where. He said nowhere. He said not to take it out. He said to finish building it. He said he had 3 weeks and 11 points. That night, he spread Renz's blueprints out on the floor and sat down over them. He looked at the 11 points and the lines between them, and at the 12th, unnamed point. The knot. a round pit beyond the clearing with its upper ring cut away. He stared at it for 2 hours. Then it dawned on him. He grabbed a piece of charcoal and drew a line on the paper from Lockmar. Lockmar wasn't on Renz's map. Lockmar was taken 108 years after his death. Darren drew the line, and it lay exactly between the ridge and the knot. He sat down on the floor and couldn't breathe. Renz's pattern consisted of 11 points, but it wasn't closed. Renz hadn't finished it. He was missing 1 point in the southwest, and in that very spot, 108 years later, people built a city and named it Lockmar. And Darren Cole had just closed that city with his own hands, without knowing why. He left Lockmar at dawn. 18 people went with him, Hald Rain and 4 guards, and 13 men from among those who had come from Broda. Vesta Horn stayed behind in the city. She stood at the city gates and told him that if he didn't return, 40 people would go back down into the cellars. Darren said he would return. He walked ahead, carrying a 20-stone beam on his shoulder without even noticing its weight. It was a 4-day journey to the clearing. He made it in 2. He didn't run because people were following him. He walked at a pace that they could keep up with, and it still wore them out to the bone. A fire was burning in the northern wedge. Darren walked in and stopped. There were over 30 people in the guardhouse, and he didn't know a single one of them. Garrison soldiers, patrolmen from 3 sectors, 2 merchants with a cart. They were sleeping on his bunks and warming themselves by his hearth, and when he entered, not a single one even looked up. He stood in the doorway watching this, and realized that for all 60 days he'd been in Lokmar, his guard posts had been operating without him. Every night, he stepped outside and looked at the sign. Body 5,400. Tarvindri had arrived from 2 stones. He'd arrived on foot by morning, and he was different. He'd lost weight and grown a beard, and a real sword, not a training blade, hung from his belt. He stood before Darren, remaining silent, and then punched him in the chest. Darren didn't move. Tarv said they had been waiting 60 days. He said the stream hadn't returned to the academy. He said that Audric Fenn had written a report stating that the training was continuing and had falsified the dates. He said that 28 men were living in 4 guard posts and holding the perimeter. He said that in 60 days, they had killed 109 Void Ones and lost none. He said that last word with such a look on his face that Darren turned away. Then Tarv asked where he had been. Darren said he had been building a city. Tarv didn't believe him. Darren unfolded the blueprint, laid it on the bunk, and spoke 11 words. He said they needed to erect 7 more guard posts in 19 days. Audric Fenn arrived around noon. He listened, then sat down on the bunk and was silent for a very long time. Then he said that 7 guard posts in 19 days was impossible, even for Darren. He said the farthest points were 3 days' journey away. He said there was no forest. He said there were no people. Darren said there were people. He stepped out of the guard post, stood in the middle of the northern wedge, and spoke to those who had spent the night there. He didn't ask them to build anything. He asked them a simple question. He asked each of them how many nights in their lives they had spent sleeping out in the open. The garrison corporal with gray stubble looked at him and said, 22 years. Darren said that in that case he should look around. He said he was standing inside a shelter that the freshmen had erected in a single daylight day. He said there would be 11 such outposts, that it would take 3 days to travel between them, and that then there would not be a single night spent out in the open across the entire sector. He asked him if that was what he wanted. The corporal stood up. He said he had 40 men on patrol and that they would arrive by evening. By evening, there were 40 of them. On the 3rd day, there were 110. Rumors in the boundary traveled faster than a horseman. Patrolmen arrived. Garrison troops from 3 sectors arrived without orders. 2 merchants arrived and brought 8 wagons. A mine foreman arrived with 20 diggers and said he'd heard there was work to be had here. By the 5th day, 400 men were working in Verubka, and Darren hadn't called a single one of them. He was laying out the site. He walked from point to point and didn't sleep. He marked out the positions for the posts, cut the notches, and demonstrated each step just once. He lifted what 10 men couldn't lift. The men got used to it within 2 days and stopped being surprised. Aldrich Fenn watched this and once said aloud that he didn't understand how a single boy could keep track of 7 construction sites simultaneously across 30 leagues. Darren didn't hear him. He saw the pattern. He saw it all the time now. He'd close his eyes and see 11 points and the lines between them, and he knew where something was missing. The 5th guardhouse went up on the 7th day. The 6th on the 9th. Darren set up the hearth last and always by himself. The 7th on the 11th, the 8th on the 13th. The display flashed. Point line 5 of 12, 6 of 12, form incomplete, 12, not 11. The system counted Lockmar. On the 14th day, people came from the Varan house. There weren't 40 of them. There were 200. They came to the ridge where Darren was setting up the 9th, and they didn't speak. They set the construction site on fire. Darren saw the smoke from 6 leagues away. He ran for an hour. He arrived when it was all over. The 9th guardhouse was burning. The rafters lay in the ashes. 6 men lay nearby. 2 from the garrison, the foreman. 3 diggers. None of them were holding weapons. They'd been killed by the beams. Darren stood and looked at the scene. He didn't move for a very long time. The people around him were silent. Then he crouched down next to the foreman and looked at his hands. They were covered with calluses from the shovel, 2 fingers thick. He raised his head and saw hoof prints in the ashes. 200 horses had ridden west. The display flashed. Record destroyed, line point lost, body minus 19. Darren stared at the line. Minus 19. 19 people had spent the night under a straw mat in the unfinished 9th last night. He stood up. Tarvandri approached and said it was time to leave. He said that 200 horsemen meant war, and that they had 400 diggers with shovels. Darren said one thing. He said he wasn't leaving. He said he was finishing the building. Aldrich Fenn told him he was crazy. Darren turned to him and said no. He said that for the first time ever, he understood what he was doing. He pointed to the ashes and said that the House of Varan had traveled 200 leagues to burn down a shed made of sticks. He asked why. He said that if it had been a shed, no one would have come. He said that 200 horsemen had ridden out of the capital because someone in the capital was keeping score. He said that there was a man sitting there who knew more about form than he did. He raised his head and looked at the people around him. There were 400 of them, and they were looking at the 6 dead men. Darren told them he wouldn't try to persuade anyone. He said that whoever left would leave with honor. He said that whoever stayed had to understand one thing. He said that in 5 days, there wouldn't be 200 horsemen here. There would be everything they had. 11 men left. 389 remained. They rebuilt the 9th guard post in 2 days. Darren worked 40 hours straight. He built it in the same spot, on top of the bones. He built the hearth himself, and when the fire caught, he stood and stared into it, never moving away. The 10th was completed on the 17th day, the 11th on the 18th. Darren stood on its roof and looked out at the clearing, and it was different. 11 roofs. Between them, ruts carved by wagons. Smoke. People. The sign glowed before his eyes, and he read the line, unable to look away. Point on line 11. Of 12, form, incomplete, 1 knot missing, a knot, a round pit beyond the clearing with its upper ring cut away. Darren jumped off the roof and walked there in the dark. He reached the pit at dawn. He climbed down to the bottom and stood there looking at the masonry. 12 points, 11 are in place. There's nothing here. Bare stone and a cut-off upper ring. Darren walked around the bottom twice, feeling the walls, and couldn't figure out what to build. There was no house foundation here. There was nothing here that resembled a building. A circle 40 paces across and a wall twice a man's height, that was all. He sat down on the floor and took out Renz's latest drawing, an untitled sheet. It showed a circle with nothing inside it. No posts, no floors. Just the circle and along its edge, a thin line running the entire length. Darren stared at it for an hour. Then he looked up at the cut ring and understood everything. The top ring of the masonry wasn't decoration. It was the only thing that was actually there. Renz wasn't building a structure here. He was closing the ring. Darren climbed up and walked along the edge of the pit all the way around. 120 steps. The ring had been chipped away along its entire length in even notches. Someone had been working here for a week with pickaxes. Darren crouched down, touched a notch, and realized one more thing. They'd only chipped away the top. They hadn't touched the rest. They didn't know how it worked. They knew one thing, that if they removed the last row, it would stop working. He returned to the clearing around noon and said they needed stone. Lots of stone. Hewn stone. Audric Fenn asked how much. Darren said 120 paces around the ring in a single row, and that each stone had to fit exactly into place. He said he would do the hewing himself. The foreman was dead, but his diggers remained. They hauled stone for 4 days from a scree field 6 leagues away. Darren hewed. He hewed for 18 hours straight without a break, and his hands turned to meat, tightened up in a minute, and turned back to meat again. The return worked non-stop. He didn't feel it. He kept chiseling. On the 4th day, messengers arrived from Lochmar. Haldrain rode up on horseback and reined in his horse. He jumped down and spoke 2 words. He said that the House of Viren had marched on Lochmar. Darren straightened up, hammer in hand. Haldrain said there were 1,500 of them. He said they weren't just horsemen. He said it was the house's army with siege engines and that they had stopped a day's march from the city. He said that Vestahorn would have led the people out, but there were already 400 of them, half of them children and the elderly, and they had nowhere to go. He said she had ordered him to convey one message, that the wall still stood and they were behind it. Darren stood there, holding his hammer and staring at the ring. There were 30 stones left to lay. Tarv Indri said aloud what everyone was thinking. He said it was a 4-day journey to Lochmar and that the army would enter the city the day after tomorrow. He said there was no way they could make it in time. Darren looked at the sign. Progress. 3,200. He could cover a 4-day journey in 9 hours. He was alone, one man against 1,500 and siege engines. He stood there counting and realized it wouldn't be enough. 1,190 bodies could scatter 8. 5,400 would scatter 40. 1,500 with the engines would kill him. Not right away, but they'll kill him. And then he looked at the ring again. 30 stones. He asked Haldrain how much time they had. Hald said that the army had camped for the night and would set out in the morning, that Lochmar had a wall, and that it would take a day or 2 to break through it. Darren said that meant he had 40 hours. He dropped his hammer and said one sentence. He said he wouldn't go to Lochmar. Audric Fenn stood up. He said there were 400 men there. Darren said he knew. He said that if he went there, he would die at the wall along with them, and that it would be very beautiful and completely pointless. He said that in 120 years, Avar Rents hadn't managed to place a single ring, and that because of this, everything had died. He said he would place it. He turned to the 379 people standing around the pit and told them the truth for the first time. He said he didn't know what would happen when the ring closed. He said he knew absolutely nothing. He said the only thing he knew was that the man who had come up with this idea had been killed for a single ring, and that 200 horsemen had come for that ring and burned down a shed made of sticks. He said that meant it was worth something. He said he was asking them to give him 40 hours. Audric Fenn said he would. He said he would take 28 freshmen and 300 diggers and go to Lockmar and stand between the army and the city. He said they wouldn't win. He said they would buy a day's time. Tarv Indri said he was going with him. Darren looked at him. Tarv said that his brother had died on the battlefield without having slept, and that now he was going well-rested and of his own free will, and that those were two different things. They left an hour later. 328 men. Darren stayed by the pit with 60 diggers. He chiseled for 40 hours. He didn't sit down even once. The diggers handed him stones, then collapsed and were relieved, while Darren kept chiseling. He laid stone upon stone in a ring. He didn't measure. He could see where each one belonged. The 20th stone was laid at the 12th hour, the 25th at the 26th. By the end of the 38th hour, 3 remained. And then smoke came from the west. Darren straightened up and looked. The smoke rose in a column 4 days' journey away and was visible from the edge of the pit because the clearing is flat. He looked at it and knew that something was burning. He stepped out of thin air onto Lockmar Square. He didn't understand how. He stepped into the ring and took 1 step, then placed his second foot on the cobblestones he himself had laid 60 days ago. There was a roar all around him. Darren stood in the middle of his city, and the city was dying. The eastern gates were holding. A battering ram was pounding against them, and the tower above them was swaying. The wall had already crumbled from the inside in 2 places from the blows of the... People were running through the streets carrying buckets. 3 houses were on fire. Rows of bodies lay on the ground by the western wall. Darren looked at them and saw shovels next to the bodies. The diggers had arrived. He looked up and saw Vesta Horn. She was standing on the wall with a bow, and a strand of her gray hair was blackened by soot. She saw him, and for a second her face took on an expression that made Darren look away. She shouted down that he was 6 hours late. He asked about Audric Fenn. She said that the army had set out yesterday morning and that 328 men had blocked the road 2 leagues away and held it for 11 hours. She said that 40 had made it to the city. Darren stood there in silence. He asked about Tarv. She said that Tarv Indri was in the eastern tower. Darren went there. He walked through his city and saw everything he had built. The mill, the well, 40 houses. He walked and sensed every person inside the walls because the knot was closed. 412. He sensed them all. Tarv Indri stood on the tower, holding onto the railing. His left arm was missing below the elbow. The stump was bound with a strap. He turned his head, saw Darren, and laughed. He said that the stonemason had come after all. He said that Audric Fenn had sent word that they had won not 40 hours, but 46. He said that Audric Fenn had stayed on the road. Darren walked up to him and looked down from the wall. Below stood the army of House Varan, 1,500 men, 3 catapults, a battering ram under a canopy, orderly ranks, banners. And off to the side on a small hill stood a tent, and in front of the tent sat 3 men on horseback looking at the city. Darren looked at them. He saw the white-haired old man in the center. He asked Tarv who it was. Tarv said it was Orthan Varan, the head of the house. He said the man had come in person. And then Darren saw a second man beside him and recognized him. Castle Varan sat on a horse next to his father in full armor, gazing at the wall. Darren stood on the tower of his city, looking down, and at that moment he finally ceased to be that boy from the arena. He felt no rage. He felt a very clear, cold train of thought. He closed his eyes. He saw a shape, 12 points, an outline, and he saw Lockmar from the inside and understood what he had noticed that very night on the wall. The bend in the street from the eastern gate, the blind ends. He hadn't built the trap by accident. He'd built it just as he'd seen it, and he'd seen it because the class had seen it for him. He opened his eyes and told Tarv to open the eastern gate. Tarv thought he'd gone mad. Darren repeated himself. He said the wall was no longer holding, and that the gate would collapse in an hour, and that then 1,500 would enter the breach in a broad front. He said that if they opened the gate now, they would enter through it. He said the gate was 4 paces wide. He said that beyond the gate, the street made a bend 9 paces long and ended at a blind end of a house with 3 stones. He said that whoever entered his city would have to walk single file along the wall beneath the windows, and that this street was 120 paces long, with not a single exit. He said he had built it without thinking, and that now he understood why. Tarv Indri looked at him, holding onto the railing with one hand. Then he shouted down to have the gate opened. Orton Varen saw this from the hill and couldn't believe it. He expected a trap. He sent the first 100 to test the waters. The 100 entered the gate. Darren came down from the tower and stood alone at the bend in the street. He stood 9 steps from the gate, in front of the blind end of his own house. The 100 filed into the street, marching 4 abreast because there wasn't enough room for more, and the first ones saw him and stopped. Darren stood and waited. He hadn't drawn his weapon. 5,400 bodies, 3,200 walkers, armor, and 412 men behind him, under his roofs, every one of them making him stronger right now. He moved forward. The Varen Company was the best infantry in the boundary. They had held their ground for 11 hours against the diggers and hadn't broken. Darren passed through them in 40 seconds. He didn't kill a single one. He struck at their knees and shoulders and jaws, and they collapsed, and he kept moving forward over the bodies. The front row managed to strike him 4 times, but their blades slid across his skin and didn't penetrate. He reached the gate from the inside and flung the last one out. 100 lay in the street, writhing and moaning, and not a single one was dead. Orthon Varen watched this from the hill. Darren emerged from the gate alone and walked toward the hill across the field. 1,500 people stood watching as a boy in a tattered jacket walked across the trampled ground. No one fired a shot. The first catapult struck in the middle of the field. A stone weighing 6 stones hit him in the chest, and Darren staggered, took a step back, and steadied himself. The stone split in 2. He kept walking. Then they began to retreat. 1,500 began to retreat of their own accord, without orders. Darren approached the hillock and stopped 10 paces away. Orton Varen sat on his horse and looked down at him. He was very old and very upright, and his face was calm. He said that the boy had closed the ring. He said it as a statement of fact. Darren replied, "Yes." Orton Varen nodded like a man whose unpleasant calculation had been confirmed. He said that his great-grandfather had removed the top row a week before Renz was due to return from the capital. He said that at the time, no one knew what would happen if the ring were closed. He said he didn't know even now. He said that for 120 years, his family had watched only one, so that there would never be 12 points. Darren asked him why. And then Orton Varen told him what it was all for. He said that the House of Varen does not fight for contracts. He said that contracts are trifles for clerks. He said that the treasury, which had been leaving the boundary for 30 years, hadn't gone into anyone's pockets. He said it had gone into the ground. He said that a second node lies beneath Lockmar. He said that the 12 points aren't meant to defend the area. He said they're a key. He said that Ivar Renz didn't build guard posts so that people could sleep. He said that Renz had found a diagram in the old records and realized that the 12 interconnected points opened the boundary. Darren asked what open meant. Orthon Varen looked east and said one word. He said that they close it. He said that the boundary is not the edge of the earth. He said it was a rift, that it had been holding on by itself for 200 years, and that it was expanding by half a league a year. He said the empty ones were those who had gone through it. He said that in 20 years, it would reach the capital. He said the Varen house had known this for 120 years, and had kept silent because if they spoke up, there would be panic and it would all be over. Darren stood there listening, and a chill crept into his mind, He asked why then they had killed wrens. For the first time during the entire conversation, Orton Varan fell silent. Then he said that his great-grandfather had been afraid. He said his great-grandfather didn't know if the form would work, and that if it did, the rift would close and the boundary would vanish, and with it, everything that had sustained the Varan family for 200 years. He said his great-grandfather chose money. He said that he himself had been trying to correct that mistake for 120 years and couldn't. He said that Rence's blueprints were missing. He said that the Viren family had been searching for them for 40 years and hadn't found them. Darren pulled a black leather case from his bosom. Orton Varan looked at it and remained silent for a very long time. Then he asked where it came from. Darren said they were from the Academy's distribution master. He said the old man had kept them for 40 years and never shown them to anyone. Orton Varan closed his eyes. Then he said that over the course of 120 years, his house had killed 9 people to prevent this from happening. He said the boy had done it in 80 days with nothing but a shed and a pile of junk. He said he didn't understand how. Darren said he'd just been building. Orton Varan looked at Lockmar. He looked at the wall the boy had erected in 9 days without a single coin. Then he said one last thing. He said that the knot beneath Lockmar would open when the circuit was charged. He said he didn't know what would happen then. He said that it was no longer his concern. He turned his horse around and ordered the army to leave. Castle Varan did not follow his father. He sat on his horse and watched Darren. Then he dismounted, took off his glove, threw it on the ground, and said he was staying dot. The circuit charged for 11 days. Darren could feel it the whole time. Every night, as people fell asleep beneath his roof, he sensed something warm flowing along the lines between the points. Not power. He stopped thinking about power. He felt the form filling up. The tablet no longer displayed numbers. It showed a map. 12 points and lines, and along the lines, the numbers of those sleeping. 34 in the northern wedge, 29 in 2 stones, 412 in Lockmar. He had been burying them for 11 days. 328 people lay on the road 2 leagues from the city, and Darren went there every day and carried them himself. He found Aldrich Fenn in the middle of the road. He was lying facing the army with 9 others lying around him. Darren carried him in his arms for 4 hours and wouldn't let anyone help. He buried them all by the eastern wall. He didn't set up headstones. He placed a single hewn slab under each one because he didn't know any other way. Vestahorn told him that wasn't how people were buried. He said that was how builders were buried. Castle Varan worked alongside everyone else. He dug and carried and didn't speak. On the 4th day, he approached Darren himself and said that his father would not be returning. He said that the House of Varan had disbanded its army, that his father had shut himself away, and that he was 81 years old. He said he had not come seeking forgiveness. He said he had come because he'd spent 2 years learning to kill and, in 80 days, had realized that the Academy had raised him for that very purpose. He said he wanted to know how to lay a stone. Darren showed him once. Tarv Indri was learning to wield a blade with one hand. He cursed and fell and got back up. He told Darren that he would take charge of the section and that now there were 28 of them, -1, because the first-year class had lost 0 in the clearing, and this would go down in the Academy's records as the first such expedition in 120 years. He said he would sign the report himself. On the 12th day, the knot opened. It happened at night. The ground in the middle of Lockmar Square sank, and the same circle opened up. 40 paces. Hewn stone. The second note had lain beneath the city for 200 years, and Darren had built his city right on top of it without knowing it. He descended into it alone. It was dry and warm down there. The plaque turned over, and he read it for a very long time. Circuit powered. Second knot opened. Form ready for knowledge. Knowledge closes the fault. The price of convergence. The carrier. He stared at the last line. The carrier. He sat at the bottom of the note all night, thinking. He thought very calmly. He wasn't afraid. He recalled the 80-something days of his life. He remembered them all in their entirety because he had no others. The arena, laughter, a rotten plank across the moat, Ursa Mole pinching a corpia by the new window, Fehano Vale, who spoke up after 11 months, Tarv Indri, who sat down on the ground when the first farm was built, Aldrich Fen on the road facing the army. He thought about what Tarv had told him in the clearing. A person is not a memory. A person is what he builds. In the morning, he got up and went to the blueprints. He laid out Renz's 11 sheets and studied them for 6 hours. And at the 6th hour, he found it. On the last sheet, he found what he hadn't noticed for 80 days, because he'd been looking for lines, not letters. In the very corner, written in Renz's small hand, were 7 words. Form is reduced by those who sleep beneath it. Darren sat over the sheet, his hands trembling. Renz knew the price. Renz knew that reduction was worth the medium. And Renz had written that form is not reduced by the medium. It is reduced by those who sleep beneath it. Darren stood up. He finally understood everything. The class had never given him power. The class gave him what people returned for what had been built. He was not the source. He was the node. And if the convergence requires a vessel, then he is not the only vessel. The vessel is everyone who sleeps under his roofs. He climbed onto the wall and summoned the city. 412 people stood in the square. Another 300 had arrived from the clearing over the past 4 days. Darren stood above the node and told them the whole truth. He told them about the crack, about half a league a year, about the 20 years to the capital, about Renz, about the House of Varen, about how the 12 points are the key. He didn't sugarcoat anything. The people listened in silence. Then he said one last thing. He said that the revelation requires a vessel, and that he doesn't know what that means and isn't going to lie. He said that if he was right, the burden would fall not on him alone, but on everyone who slept under the roofs of the form. He said he didn't know if anyone would survive. He said he wouldn't ask anyone for anything. He said that on the night of the revelation, all 12 points must be filled with sleepers, and that everyone who went to sleep that night would do so of their own free will. He fell silent. Vesta Horn stepped forward first. She said she had slept in the basement for 12 years, listening to the east. She said she had been sleeping upstairs for 11 days. She said she would lie down. The old foreman with gray stubble said he had slept in the field for 22 years. He said he would lie down. Hanno Vale had arrived from the academy by wagon 2 days ahead of schedule. He had come alone. He approached Darren and said he couldn't hold anything with one hand. He said he knew how to sleep. He said he would lie down. Everyone lay down. There were 1,109 of them, spread across 12 posts, 11 guard posts, and the city. Darren walked around Lockmar alone on the night of the roll call. He went into every house. He looked at the sleeping people. He saw the people he'd pulled out of basements and forests. He saw children on bunks. He was the last to go down to the hub. He lay down on the bare stone floor. He looked at the sign. Reckoning. 1,109 bearers. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. He had never fallen asleep so easily in his life. The reckoning lasted 4 hours. The earth did not shake. Nothing rumbled. Throughout the boundary, 30 leagues from one roof to another, warmth spread, passing through the sleepers, yet they did not wake. From 12 points, everything that 1,109 people gave without knowing it flowed into the node beneath Lockmar. Everything they had received over 80 days, dry nights, warm walls, water from the well, bread from the mill, a roof. All of it was flowing back. Darren lay at the bottom of the node and saw the shape from above. He saw 12 glowing points and the lines between them, and he saw how the lines closed into a contour and how the contour began to contract. He saw a crack for the first time. It came from the east and was neither in the earth nor in the sky, and he could not tell where it was. It was enormous. It was older than anything. The outline closed in on it and pulled. The crack resisted for 4 hours, then it gave way. It gave way just as the seam between two slabs closes when the wedge finally settles. It closed slowly, and Darren felt every league of it, and felt what the 109 people had given up leaving them. No one had died. He checked on everyone. He could sense them all. They were asleep and at peace. By the 4th hour, the crack had closed, and the boundary ceased to exist. Darren felt the knot beneath him grow cold. He opened his eyes. The plaque hung before him. It was blank. All the lines had vanished. No body, no path, no bark, no armor. Only one line remained at the bottom, and it glowed steadily. Form reduced. Rift closed. Register of the erected closed. The bearer is free. Then that line went dark, too. Darren sat at the bottom of the node. He raised his hand and looked at it. He picked up a pebble from the floor and squeezed it. The pebble didn't crumble. He tried to stand up quickly and stood up like a normal person. He ran his fingernail across his forearm, and a scratch remained. It didn't heal. He sat at the bottom of the pit, looking at the scratch and laughing. He climbed out at dawn. The city was waking up. People were coming out of their houses, clueless. Vesta Horn stood in the square looking east, and Darren walked over and stood beside her. To the east was the sky. Ordinary. Not low. Not the color of ash. Just the sky. A month later, 2 people from the Chancellery arrived in Lockmar. There were 2 of them, and they were very flustered. They said that the boundary wasn't responding. They said that the patrols were reporting that there were no void ones. They said that the ash at the clearing had produced the first grass in 200 years. They asked what had happened here. Darren was sitting on a rock, chiseling a slab, and said he didn't know. Tarv Indri stood nearby, leaning on his blade with one hand, and said the same thing. 6 months later, the academy was closed. It wasn't disbanded. They simply stopped recruiting. There was no one left to fight. Valiant Dorn resigned of his own accord, and he was found in his office at his desk. He had been dead for 3 days, and a stack of old reports lay before him. Oresh Vent arrived in Lokmar in the fall. He walked through the streets very slowly, touching the walls. He stopped at the eastern wall, where 328 lay beneath the slabs. He stood there for a long time. Then he approached Darren and said that he had kept the case for 40 years and didn't know why. Darren told him that now he knew. Oresh Vent asked him what he would do next. Darren looked east. There, beyond the former boundary, lay lands that no one had seen in 200 years. There stood cities that had been taken 12 years ago, 6 years ago, and 40 years ago. There were many of them. They had basements, and people lived in those basements. Darren stood up and picked up a hammer. He said he didn't have a single number or a single line left, and that he was now just a man. He said it didn't matter. He said he still had his hands. He set down a slab, leveled it, and picked up the next one. The old man watched him and finally asked why he was still building if he wasn't getting paid for it anymore. Darren stood up straight. He looked at the city he had raised from dead stone, for the 40 chimneys, for the children on the street whom he'd pulled out of the basements. He looked at the eastern wall, beneath which lay the people who'd given him 46 hours.
He thought about what a one-armed guy in Virupka had once told him, "A man isn't his memory, a person is what he builds." He turned to the old man and answered him with a single sentence. He said he had never been paid. He said they had simply given him back what was his. Then he bent down and laid the next stone,